Order. Dr. Caroline Johnson to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start with what I think we all do agree on. I think we all agree that we need to live sustainably. I think we all agree that food security is important. I think we all agree that we need cheap energy, reliable energy, for the economy to thrive. I think we can all agree, and certainly I know from my conversations with him that the Prime Minister agrees, that proposals to carpet vast swathes of our best farmland with industrial solar panels are wrong. There is little doubt that renewable energy sources are crucial for combating climate change and ensuring a sustainable future. And I'm not opposed to solar panels in general. They're an important part of the mix of renewable energy sources. They do have some merit in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and in achieving our net zero ambitions. But in the process of achieving this laudable aim, we must be very wary of unintended consequences. There is a considerable risk that in the name of saving the environment, we end up destroying it in the process. And that in the name of energy security, we make ourselves dependent on food imports. Firstly, I'd like to begin by addressing the most salient issue, which is, in my view, is food security. The drive to net zero carbon emissions can only be sustained so long as there is food on our shelves. We would ideally have policies prioritising energy security and food security, but as it stands, there is a balance which is tipped too far in the way of energy security at the expense of food security. National self-sufficiency in food has fallen. It's fallen from 74% to 61% since the mid-80s. While the government may be right that food security does not necessitate complete food security during peacetime, and it is reasonable to assume that some level of international trade in food will always remain a contributing factor, the war in Ukraine and its associated impacts on food security and food prices internationally has demonstrated that the maintenance of historical trade patterns can't always be relied upon. It is in this context that large-scale solar projects have threatened to swallow up rural constituencies with applications over the past few years. Alarmingly, these projects disproportionately affect the most fertile parts of the United Kingdom. One of the most targeted counties for industrial solar applications is Lincolnshire. This is the breadbasket of England. It alone produces 30% of the UK's vegetables, 18% of its poultry, and is responsible for 12% of the country's total food production. Lincolnshire, without a doubt, has some of the UK's best and most versatile farmland, and because it is also flat and, for the UK at least, relatively sunny.
My honourable
I'm very happy to give way to my honourable friend.
I'm extremely grateful, since the honourable lady has done a great service to this House by bringing this debate to our attention, because my constituency, as you will know, in South Holland and the Deepings, contains a disproportionate amount of that very fine agricultural land, even by Lincolnshire standards. And to compromise food security in the interest of energy security is a nonsense. We will make our country more dependent on imports, damaging the environment and robbing our people of the chance of buying and consuming domestically made food.
I do, as is usually the case, completely agree with my right honourable friend and parliamentary neighbour. And he will be very aware that there are currently 12 NSIP applications in progress in Lincolnshire for large solar projects, including Beacon Fen, Springwell, Heckington Fen and Foss Green Energy, all within my constituency. These five solar schemes alone would cover 9,109 hectares of farmland. Such an area would otherwise produce 81,000 tonnes of wheat, which would make 57 million loaves of bread, or indeed 1.5 billion Weetabix. Despite the government guidance that solar prospectors avoid using best and most versatile land, many of these proposals would cover enormous swathes of it. Foss Green will use 2,479 acres of prime farmland, thereby reducing the UK's valuable food production capacity and exacerbating food insecurity. Springwell Solar Farm in my constituency is made up of 30% best and most versatile land, and Heckington and Fen application 49% best and most versatile land. While Lincolnshire undoubtedly has, and I'm sure there are colleagues in this room that will agree, the best farmland in the country, it is not the only one affected by the menace of these massive farmland-consuming solar applications. The Honourable Member for Rutland and Melton, who is unable to attend today, has been campaigning assiduously against Mallard Pass solar plant in her constituency, a project to be located on 2,105 acres of agricultural land, 70% of which is Grade 1, the very best farmland we have. This is the equivalent of 1,300 football pitches and will be 10 times larger than the current largest solar farm built in the United Kingdom. I will give way.
Giving way. And just to reinforce her point about where these issues arise, even in my constituency of Sedgefield, we've got an application that's in for 1,200 acres, but there's also another number of applications of smaller scale which make it into an aggregate of 2,000 acres between the villages of Bishopton and Brafferton. And this would just completely be inappropriate in scale, but also in terms of the quality of land. It does seem as though it's almost a marginal differentiation between 3A and 3B as to who makes that decision and how it is. And I think we just need to make sure we've got robustness in terms of the integrity of the land that's being used to make sure it is kept where possible for agricultural use.
My right honourable friend is completely right, and he demonstrates that this menace stretches the length and breadth of the country. And I will come to his point, a very well-made point about the grading of land later. Yes, of course.
I'm very grateful. My friend is making a very powerful speech. Is she aware, in relation to use of best and most versatile land, that the Secretary of State for DEFRA, when appearing before the EFRA Select Committee last month, made a statement that he was reviewing the suitability of best and most versatile land for solar planning applications. As she will be aware, I'm a supporter of solar energy as she is, but it needs to be in the right place, and we should not have concentrations which make vast areas, as she's been describing, the honourable gentleman has just described, become industrial scale beyond a reasonable level. And it's a question of balance that we have to get right.
I thank my honourable friend for that contribution. I wasn't aware of the statement at the EFRA committee, but I am aware from my discussions with the DEFRA Secretary of State of his love and attention to farmland and his desire to see that food security is protected.
Would my friend give way? Well, I'm grateful to my friend for giving way, and she knows that I'm the last person to be a NIMBY, and Nottinghamshire has amongst the richest heritage for industry and for energy production dating back centuries. But the point that my right honourable friend from Ludlow has made could equally be applied to our situation in Nottinghamshire. We are not opposed to solar farms, but it is the scale of the applications and their aggregate impact upon the landscape, which is so profound. Were the 3 applications to go ahead in my constituency, I know one which borders my honourable friends, they will stretch from the South Yorkshire border all the way down to the Vale of Belvoir, peppering thousands of acres of land and impacting over 60 villages. The landscape of this part of Nottinghamshire will be changed for a generation. That's simply unfair and exactly what the Prime Minister has campaigned against, an overzealous application of net zero which turns the public off.
My right honourable friend, and as he mentioned, a parliamentary neighbour, is absolutely right, and it is very important that we look at the cumulative effects of the applications and the industrialisation of our landscapes. Again, this is...
My honourable friend, give way.
Of course, I will get the next sentence out eventually.
As my honourable friend has now heard from the proud county of Lincolnshire, which she has spoken about this issue, from Shropshire, from Durham, from Nottinghamshire, and she's about to hear from Bedfordshire. Could I just gently point out to members here that every single backbench member of Parliament in this debate is a Conservative member of Parliament. There is not a single Labour backbench MP to hear, or Liberal for that matter, to talk about the impact of large-scale solar farms. The point I wish to make to her is that small-scale solar farms in my constituency have been welcomed by local communities because they have spoken to parish councils, they've worked with local residents to ensure that the siting is familiar. It is these large-scale financial vehicles masquerading as solar panels that are trying to help us achieve net zero, which has caused consternation, including, I'm afraid to say, the East Park Energy proposal in my own constituency.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his contribution, and I'm expecting to hear from Buckinghamshire, Wiltshire, Suffolk, Yorkshire, and Redditch, and more from Lincolnshire. I don't miss anyone out. As we go, and the South West, as we go along. And indeed, on that point, the Attorney General, the Right Honourable Member for Banbury, and our Solicitor General, the Honourable Member for Witney, are of course unable to speak today, and the Honourable Member for Henley is not well. We also have the Conservative candidate Rupert Harrison for the new Woodstock and Bicester seat, and they, as a four, are actively campaigning against the Botley West solar farm in Oxfordshire. Now, if it's approved, they tell me this will be the size of Heathrow and the largest solar plant in Europe. It will encroach across 4 parliamentary constituencies in Oxfordshire, and a project of this scale poses a disproportionate threat to agricultural land, much of which is of best and most versatile status, and results in the loss of swathes of open countryside. My honourable friend, the member for South Derbyshire, going to another part of the country, is also very concerned about the massive solar application on productive farmland between Rosliston and Drakeclough, and the food security implications of the loss of such good farmland. The potential ramifications of putting our best agricultural land out of use for 40 years would be incredibly destabilising. Arable land in the UK is declining, currently at 14.8 million acres, the lowest since World War II, with 100,000 acres being taken out of cultivation annually. Massive-scale solar plants, and I call them plants quite specifically because they are not really farms, withdraw hundreds of hectares of urgently needed farmland from UK food production. If such projects are allowed to go ahead, then agricultural products will have to come from abroad, countries where the environmental, animal welfare standards may be less rigorous than our own, at a greater economic, and due to transportation and other things, environmental cost. I want to move on to land use strategy. Solar must take its appropriate place in the many conflicting demands on land, for agriculture, for housing, from some people for rewilding, health and conservation, but it does not trump all the others. We simply cannot have it all. We must make intelligent use of the finite resources of land that we have. We must balance what some see as conflicting priorities. Some people say the land underneath solar panels can be grazed by livestock. You heard that one? In practical experience, this is absolute nonsense. I challenge you to look around the ground-mounted solar panels already in place and see how often they can find animals grazing underneath them. The government needs to develop a comprehensive, carefully thought out land strategy to ensure that our best farmland is not put at risk like this. I will.
She's very good. I won't speak at length about the terrible development encroaching on devices, and my honourable friend's going to speak for Wiltshire shortly. In Wiltshire, though, 10 of the largest solar sites in England, of the 10, 8 are in Wiltshire, so we have a real problem. Can I ask her, she's talking about the necessity for national planning, does she agree that local authorities should have more power to determine a solar strategy for their area rather than having to conform to unwieldy national rules?
I certainly think that local people should have more say in what goes into their area in this regard. But I would be cautious about a solar strategy for each area, because in some areas, such as in Lincolnshire, where we have such high volumes of food-producing land, it may not be appropriate at all very much to have certainly any massive-scale solar panels. The loss of good quality arable land at a time of unstable world trade situations is a first-rate folly, particularly when there are other sites available, infinitely more sensible, such as brownfield sites, domestic roofs, commercial rooftops. This should worry everybody, wherever they live. And it is, as my honourable friend has said, disappointing to see that the benches are full of Conservative members, but no Liberal Democrats or Labour people have turned up with any interest in food security, because food security is important for those who live in the cities too. Can I ask, does the Minister agree that the Government urgently need to produce a joined-up land use strategy? Can he update the House on what the Government is doing to encourage brownfield use, poor quality land use, industrial and warehouse roof use? What discussions he is having with energy suppliers regarding a balance between standing charges and usage costs in order to incentivise the installation of solar on industrial units? There is a long backlog of people waiting grid connections. What plans does he have for grid connection prioritisation for those using brownfield sites, industrial roofs and domestic roofs? These connections are prohibitively expensive. That is also driving these very massive scale solar. What assessment has he made of the actual cost rather than the charged costs of these connections? I also want to deal with the concept of efficiency. Hinkley Point C, currently under construction in Somerset, will take up 174 hectares and is expected to produce 26 terawatt-hours of electricity per year for 60 years. By comparison, Springwell Solar Farm in my constituency would be almost 25 times that size, would produce 950,000 megawatt-hours, just shy of 1 terawatt-hour a year for 40 years. That's 25 times the size for 25 times less energy for less time. I will.
I'll return to Yorkshire later, but on the more strategic point, I mean, quite rightly, the member for Ludlow, my right honourable friend for Ludlow, has talked about this being a matter of balance, and she's highlighting quite what we're paying, as it were, per terawatt for solar power. Other countries, Germany most particularly, that have depended on a balance of solar power and wind, have actually found themselves let down completely by the system. They have a word for it, Dunkelflaut, when you've got cloud and no wind. And they've had years in which they've had really serious electricity deficits. So, in fact, whilst we all agree solar power is an important part of the repertoire, as it were, government has, it is not the overall answer.
I completely agree with my right honourable friend, and actually he must have been reading my speech in advance, because this is the next point that I come to, which is that it is questionable to what extent solar is the most appropriate source for renewable energy. In the UK, solar generates maximum power for an average of only 2.6 hours per day, a figure that falls to less than 1 hour a day during winter, the time of year when energy is most needed. In practice, you're most likely to need energy when it's dark and cold, not when it's bright daylight and sunny. And battery storage is also carbon intensive, and it also requires rare earth metals. As my honourable friend, the member for Buckingham, has pointed out before, there is a land use efficiency here. Currently, 2,000 acres of solar panels are required to power around 50,000 homes. But one small modular reactor, requiring a space of just 2 football pitches, would power 1 million homes. And going back to my honourable friend's point about wind, a 140-acre solar project is capable of supplying electricity to 9,000 homes, but offshore wind turbines generate maximum power for an average of 9.4 hours each day, and just one turbine in the North Sea has the capacity to power 16,000 homes without bothering largely a single person or destroying any of our best and most versatile land. Moving on to planning, my last debate on this issue in June last year focused on planning regulations, and I don't plan to go into huge details on that again today. But since then, giving the government credit, it has clearly tried to get to grips with this issue, releasing a new national policy statement on renewable energy infrastructure in January. But I fear there's still a loophole in these regulations. The cumulative impact term of solar applications is not properly defined, and the regulations are still not characterised by strict rules but by guidance, which can be flouted. Many planners still utterly ignore the guidelines to avoid the use of best and most versatile land. Half of the Heckington Fen project in my constituency would be on best and most versatile land. No. And horrifyingly, the Durax project in East Yorkshire proposes to swallow up 94% of it as B&B land. I will give way to my friend.
for giving way, and she's making an excellent speech. Thankfully, in the northern part of Lincolnshire that I represent, we've been fairly free of these solar farms at the moment, but a number of applications have flooded in recently following some developments in the Immingham and Stallingborough area. When you read the planning guidance to local authorities, it could be interpreted much more robustly by those planning authorities than it is at present. So, allowing for the fact that they interpret it rather loosely, I would urge the Minister, when he responds, to confirm that government are prepared to tighten up on the guidance to local authorities.
Yeah.
Thank you, honourable friend, and I agree, and I thank him for supporting my calls for the Minister to ensure that these guidance are tightened up to protect our farmland. It is very clear that developers are taking advantage of the absence of rigid and specific government guidance at the moment to protect B&B land, proposing ever larger solar installations at NSIPs in suitable places. As one developer commented, that's the neat thing about the NSIP process. You put all the powers you need into one consent and have relative certainty, certainly in their view, of the consent being granted. While the upgrade of substations within the electrical network is intended to be a positive thing that enhances local infrastructure, in my area it has inadvertently attracted speculators looking to profit from the farmland. When substations undergo upgrades, a cluster of large solar applications tends to emerge nearby. This approach is cheaper for companies seeking to complete these solar projects, but does not mean that they're being built in the right place. And unfortunately, the consequence of this is a shift from a few small, unobtrusive solar panels on brownfield sites, smaller amounts of solar panels on poor quality farmlands, a field here and there, but now we've got massive industrial installations in completely the wrong place, based merely on grid connection. These industrial projects significantly alter the landscape, sometimes entirely swallowing whole villages, transforming once green fields into sterile expanses of photovoltaic glass. These companies have no ties to the land and no stake in its preservation. One issue I've raised with the Minister previously, and that was brought up by my honourable friend from Sedgefield, is that developers are having the land grades analysed themselves, and they appear to be finding that the land is of lower grade than DEFRA and others thought it was.
Surprise, surprise.
Surprise, surprise indeed. There is a clear incentive for a developer to report a lower grade of land in this context. The Minister has said to me that he would take steps to review this. Can he update the House on what progress has been made? I will give way to my honourable friend.
I'm delighted to get a second bite of the cherry, and I'm grateful for my honourable friend for giving me one. There are three deceptions, aren't there? The first that she described is of dodgy surveyors and agronomists reclassifying land so that it can be developed. The second is that these very large developments, of course, include land of different grades. So even if part of the land is grade 1 or 2, because some isn't, the developer prosecutes their case accordingly. And the third, of course, is that by having these very large developments, local authorities and local people are taken out of the frame altogether. These are deliberate deceptions, and it's up to the Minister, who I know is a fine man, with a strong sense of diligence in this regard, to take action to end them.
Yeah.
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and he summarises in large parts of my speech very succinctly. I say thank you. Another issue I want to raise is the issue that large-scale solar may technically be classified as clean energy, but many tell me that the companies which supply it are neither morally clean nor environmentally green. My honourable friend, the member for Rutland and Melton, earlier this week had an adjournment debate, making an interesting but rather disturbing speech relating to the use of forced labour in supply chains of solar panels. Her debate highlighted that many of these solar panels also use vast quantities of coal in the mining and production supply chain of the panels. Foss Green, one of the organisations trying to muscle in on rural Lincolnshire, appears as a British company, but its structure is rather complex. It's actually a joint venture involving two established solar developers, Windell Energy and Recurrent Energy. The latter of these is, according to the firm itself, the wholly owned subsidiary of Canadian Solar Incorporated. As highlighted by the Honourable Member for Rutland and Melton, Canadian Solar gets its panels almost exclusively from China, where about 60% of the grid is accounted for by coal-powered energy plants, These plants will have a significant carbon footprint of their own, and once the panels are produced, they will have to be transported to and within the UK on ships and lorries powered by hydrocarbons. The other allegations made against Canadian solar, which I understand the Minister will be investigating, are particularly worrying. So what is the government doing to investigate the actual benefit of solar projects, taking into account their production, their transportation, their regular cleaning and their ultimate disposal, and to ensure that we're not complicit in the use of forced labour? It is self-evident that companies such as these have little time for the views of those who will be most affected by them. I recently conducted a survey in my constituency in the areas most affected by current large-scale NSIP applications. Letters were sent directly to thousands of households in Sleaford and North Hykeham, and I received over 2,000 handwritten responses. These are not simple online forms that can be clicked and submitted multiple times. They were thought-out responses, many of which contain pages, and I mean pages, of heartfelt comments. Of those respondents, 90% said they were concerned about the enormous scale of the proposals. 68% were extremely concerned about the use of productive farmland, and 55% said they were extremely concerned about the visual impact. The accusation often levelled against people who are against these proposals but have to live next to them is that this is merely NIMBYism. We like solar panels, but just not next to me. But actually, although a visual impact was a considerable factor in the responses, the greater concern was the loss of productive farmland. A significant proportion of my constituents are veterans, currently serving military personnel, and those who work in agriculture. And they, more than anyone else, understand the extreme importance of food security, with the most commonly cited response being we must protect our prime agricultural land in the interests of food security. With that said, I do also have sympathy with aesthetic arguments. Lincolnshire is a particularly beautiful county. The countryside has been an inspiration for much of our nation's best art and literature. Lincolnshire's preeminent literary figure, Alfred Lord Tennyson, felt his deepest sympathies for an unaltered rural England and found himself a stranger in the rapidly changing industrial and mercantile world of 19th century England. His work has remained remarkably relevant to our situation today. His much-loved poem, The Brook, a memorable personification of a stream, ends with the following lines: "For men may come and men may go, but I go on forever." What do we allow to go on forever? Do we allow the industrialisation of our countryside? Or do we honour the landscape which has inspired so much of our great literature? Edmund Burke noticed that happiness is the promise of beauty, and it is clear that rural communities will be far unhappier after being deprived of the natural beauty of their surroundings. Although solar prospectors often hide behind their claims that their panels will be hidden from public view, this is often not the case. They are often more than 4 metres tall, twice the height of the tallest gentleman in here, and especially visible from higher areas. Even in a relatively flat area like Lincolnshire, enormous solar seas such as Foss Green Project could be seen from the limestone cliff running down the county. The glint and glare of them could disturb any onlookers and are a particularly big threat to our national treasure, the red arrows.
My full height. To our,
Still half a solar panel.
Can I just address this issue of this dismissive attitude of the word NIMBYism? Many of the people who live in these parts of the countryside, in Lincolnshire, Yorkshire and the rest, move there because of the environment. They go there for a peaceful retirement, or because they like to work there, or they want their children to grow up in good environments. It is distinctly unconservative, to use a phrase frequently used at the moment, unconservative to dismiss people's property rights as NIMBYism. They balked their view. They placed themselves and invested their savings in the environment we're talking about. And we take it away, we shouldn't just dismiss it as NIMBYism.
I quite agree with my right honourable friend, unsurprisingly. It's important that we represent the constituents that we are sent here to represent. And if they are unhappy with the putting of solar farms in front of their house, whether that's because of productive farmland or because it's ruining the environment in which they live, then we are here to represent those concerns.
Would we give way?
I will give way.
Okay. I'm grateful to have giving way again. If I well, I hesitate can I just re-emphasise the point that she just made about the height of the solar panels here? Because I do wonder if some of the proponents and some of those considering these applications within government actually understand the scale of what's being proposed here. The one that my honourable friend and I share, the application that we share, the panels there are as high as a house.
Yes.
And some of them will be placed within just a few metres of a home.
Yes.
Imagine if that was your home.
Exactly.
This is not a solar farm that one might have thought of in the recent past. This will have a profoundly detrimental impact upon that person's quality of life. And we have to consider that when we're looking at these applications.
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and he is quite right. The simple scale of these is very, very difficult to comprehend. And I know that my office have worked hard on some maps demonstrating some of the larger projects that are currently built and comparing them to the projects that are currently proposed in his constituency and mine. And the graphics are really very, very telling. And it's also noticeable that these projects offer very little commensurate benefit for the people most affected by them financially too. Some of my constituents wrote in their responses whether solar panels would reduce in a reduction in their electricity bills for the local community, as compensation perhaps for the industrialisation of the landscape. But no, the electricity produced will go straight into the national grid and be transported to other areas of the country. As we've discussed, this is not mere NIMBYism. Communities should not be criticised for resisting solar projects if they are in the wrong place, as these are. Indeed, there should be a greater push for rational, proactive policy to facilitate renewable energy schemes that don't harm our landscape, rather than steamroll over the views of local. Large-scale solar projects are a democratic issue. We are liable to sacrifice public trust with the opaque planning laws, eschewing public consultation, silencing the voice of residents affected by these schemes. The rightful concerns of residents who do not wish to live in an energy factory must count. I'm hopeful that we as representatives can do much to redress this balance. So what is to be done? We recognise solar energy as a piece of the jigsaw in our transition to a greener future, but we must strike a balance. We should insist on alternative locations for solar panels, such as brownfield sites, industrial areas, roofs, rather than sacrificing any of our valuable agricultural land and pristine landscapes. So can the Minister confirm that the Government agrees with this statement and will reiterate its promise to protect our best and most versatile land? I would like to reiterate that I'm not opposed to solar power in general, we need to revise the strategy for where it's implemented and what scale. 90% of respondents to my survey said they would favour solar on industrial roofs. It is estimated there are 600,000 acres of south-facing industrial roof space in the United Kingdom, not currently used for solar. A push to prioritise industrial, residential, brownfield, poor quality land would be a step in the right direction. The issue at hand is one which affects us all. There's a creeping danger that our countryside becomes rapidly industrialised. If allowed to go through unchallenged, as we've seen today, these projects will stretch across vast expanses of our rural communities throughout the country, putting our best agricultural land out of use for more than a generation, transforming the character of our green and pleasant land. We, as representatives of largely rural communities here today, must find common cause. We must work to maintain the beautiful character of our countryside, support our farming industries, protect food security in times of great uncertainty, and make the voices of local residents heard. And this is an urgent problem. If the polls are right, and I don't think they are, hopefully, but if they are, and the upcoming election were to be lost, we cannot rely on Labour ministers. Look at the House today. Where do you see a Labour MP? You don't. Simply what the opposition spokesperson. No backbench Labour MP or Liberal Democrat MP has come today. We cannot rely on Labour ministers to protect our farmland for the simple reason, as is obvious today, they do not care about our countryside. This is why they represent so little of it. We must therefore ensure that any solution we pursue is done both robustly and quickly. In the Prime Minister's own words, on his watch, he will not allow great swathes of our best agricultural land to be swallowed by solar farms. We will make sure that he lives up to this promise.
Yeah. Thank you. The question is that this House has considered large-scale solar farms Joe McLean.
Privilege to be called to respond first, to follow my dear friend, the Honourable Lady for Sleaford and North Hykeham, and to be surrounded by so many honourable and right honourable colleagues who have already made contributions and no doubt will make excellent ones when they follow me. And I want to make it clear before I make my wider arguments for the benefit of local residents in my constituency, rural Worcestershire, who I've had the pleasure of meeting at the site itself, that I strongly oppose the solar farm development proposals for 287 acres of beautiful rural farmland in my constituency in the Stock Green, Inkborough area at the Roundhill Wood site. I've been vocal on the subject. I've lodged my objections with the Planning Authority and on the public record and in the press, and I do so again. When I met the Roundhill Wood Solar Farm Opposition Group and its lead spokesman, the indefatigable Phil Coathup, I was completely persuaded by their reasoning. Phil isn't able to be with us today, but I am 100% sure that he is watching, so hello, Phil. Hello, Tigger, who's a horse, and thank you for all that you've done, and thank you also to my honourable friend for calling this debate and giving us all this opportunity to air our concerns of our constituents. So, actually, a lot of the comments that I'm going to make, I'm going to curtail slightly because my friend has made them so well, but I echo many, many of them. Residents in my seat have told me that they are wholly supportive of renewable energy, as am I, from solar power, and the ambition of tackling climate change more generally, but have a number of concerns. The loss of prime agricultural land at a time of war. Residents argue, and I couldn't agree more, that farming subsidies should not be used to encourage more solar farms. What we really need are more wheat and dairy farms so that we can be sustainable as a population. Of course, the impact on green spaces, the beautiful area, the risk of fire and hazard, as we've seen in many others of these developments. Residents fear that there could be fires and electrical storms and many other issues that have a dangerous impact on the area. And in our particular case, it's the distance from the grid. The 2 planning applications submitted for this project will cause massive intrusion into communities. The primary site is located in Inkborough, while the national grid substation is located in Feckenham, meaning that there will have to be extensive cabling between these 2 sites. And as a further aspect to this particular proposal, Mr Henderson, which is the loss of the literary landscape. Of course, in our Worcestershire countryside, we're very proud of our connection to J.R.R. Tolkien. That is known and said to be where he lived and worked when he was escaping from Birmingham. Some of his work is thought to have a significant inspiration taken from our beautiful fields and areas. And in fact, Andrew Morton recently came to my constituency to discuss the importance of this area in inspiring Tolkien's The Shire. According to Andrew Morton, Tolkien's visits to his aunt's farm called Bag End in Dormston directly inspired the name of the house of the fictional character Bilbo Baggins. And if this application were to pass, this landscape would become a construction site. The views that inspired great works of literature would be lost forever. And residents also suggest, as my honourable friend has said, that we should put solar panels on rooftops, warehouse roofs, which are, of course, ample elsewhere in my constituency because it's a logistics hub. Although it is clear that this can't meet the UK's whole solar power needs, of course.
I'm intrigued by her and my other honourable friend's literary commentary, but I'd like just to draw attention and ask a question on the economics. She'll be aware that the strike price for solar power was £47 per megawatt hour. The last auction is going to go to £61 per megawatt hour. And what's underpinning farmers deciding that perhaps they should give their land up is that the economics of farming are finding it very difficult to compete with the economics of the pricing at these auctions. And does she also agree that if it is the case, which I believe is true, that the government now has maybe 4 times the amount of solar production capacity on offer than it actually requires, that there needs to be an economic answer both to the pricing of solar power and to support our farmers?
My honourable friend has made some excellent points. He's right, of course, that these commercial pressures, as well as the legislation that we signed up for, which I was happy to vote for to reach net zero, but between the 2 of these pressures are actually driving this. We've got a lot of unintended outcomes for this policy, which was introduced for laudable aims, and it is time to pause this and look again. So, people have talked about this issue of NIMBYs, and I think it is a really interesting issue because people will ask, where would you put these solar panels instead? And where are you going to put the additional ones that will be required to fulfil our solar capacity targets? Because I think our British energy strategy includes ambitions to have 70 gigawatts of solar capacity by 2035, and I think we're at something like 15.7 gigawatts as of January this year. I believe that if we oppose something and we don't like what's in front of us, we should actually suggest what would be done instead. I think we should be constructive. We shouldn't just oppose things and not come up with a solution. That's what Labour does. That's not my style. And by the way, on the subject of Labour, it's unclear to me and local residents what Labour's position locally is on this solar power project. It shouldn't really surprise anyone that Labour locally are sitting on the fence, or perhaps sitting on a solar panel, if I may stretch the analogy, on this issue. It's what they do on every issue. They say one thing and they do another. Or they change their mind every 5 minutes, and they're certainly doing that locally. But people will probably say to me, well, aren't you just a NIMBY? And maybe I should ask myself this as well, because as some of you might know, I had the great privilege of serving as Housing and Planning Minister, and I'm very familiar with these debates. But I say to my honourable friends and right honourable friends, it's the wrong question. It is the wrong way of looking at the problem, and I'll explain why briefly. Deciding where to put infrastructure, whether it's housing, roads or solar farms, is always going to be controversial. We need to build these things. Nobody wants them next to them. Certainly nobody, to my knowledge, has ever campaigned for more development, be it housing or infrastructure, next to them. Therefore, it's often said, those people must be NIMBYs and their views pushed aside in the interests of progress. There's no easy way around this, even if we prioritise the views of local communities, because the idea that there's anywhere else in the country where somebody won't object to something being built is a fantasy. So I say to the House, it is idiotic to divide people into two camps, NIMBY and not NIMBY, unless they're Liberal Democrats, of course, who are bananas. That stands for build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. That's their policy. I have the greatest of respect for the YIMBY movement. I really do. I think they're doing some good things. But I suspect that were those people to move to a different area, out of a city, into the countryside, or next to a development site, or in the green belt, and that was about to be built over, they might change their view. And, I do speak as someone who's got a little bit of understanding of this area. I think all of us MPs do. We understand human nature, and we know that people will deceive themselves and others. I would be happy to be proved wrong, but the evidence in front of me strongly suggests I'm right. So it's pointless and wrong to attack NIMBYs when everyone essentially feels the same about our landscape and our area. Yes, I'll give it to my friend.
That's right. And if a Member of Parliament doesn't defend their own area, then surely they're not really doing their job, are they? My backyard is South Holland the Deepings, and I will certainly defend it to the death from the kind of menace that this kind of large-scale solar represents.
Of course. I really enjoy hearing my right honourable friend speak about this matter, because he has, more than anyone else, brought this concept of beauty and that impact on our well-being into public policy more than anybody else, and I thank him for that. I want to deliberately move away from this concept of blaming people for being NIMBYs, because unless we actually understand how human psychology works, we won't be able to solve these problems of where to put things that nobody wants. I do want to set out, I think there's another way to think about it. It is, of course, much easier and cheaper to install infrastructure on a virgin field rather than engineer it somewhere else in the built environment or brownfield. That is more favourable, but it's going to take cash. If anybody tells you you can simply complete a project on a brownfield for the same cost as on a greenfield, they've no idea what they're talking about. Yes, Labour, I am looking at you, because that is essentially their plan for reforming the planning system. Why? Well, brownfield is brown for a reason. Something else was there before. That something else needs to be removed, the site put back to a clean condition. That involves removing toxic materials and engineering problems. That costs money. That's why we have government agencies and grants funded to the tune of £10.5 billion in the case of Homes England to do exactly that. But that money, of course, is our money. It's taxpayers' money. If you want more of it, you have to spend more money on it, meaning less money to spend on all the other things that voters want and the opposition has promised, like the NHS and so on. Oh, and by the way, Labour have also repeatedly said that they want to build on the green belt, or maybe the grey belt, whatever that is. Now, look, I'll be honest, there is some merit in that argument That is because we're actually already doing that. That is government policy when it's done sensibly in consultation with local communities and backed by government funding. This actually is happening all over the country. Where it isn't happening, surprise, surprise, is in Labour-run planning authorities, most notably London, where Sadiq Khan is woefully behind on all his housing targets, even though he's been generously subsidised by taxpayers who aren't lucky enough to live in London to the tune of £4 billion of their money from around the rest of the country, subsidising his frankly useless delivery record. And what's sad and shameful about this is the fact that the need for housing and the cost of it in London is acute. The so-called housing crisis, which frankly is just as much an immigration crisis as a housing crisis, is worse in London. And in fact, if the Labour Mayor of London actually built enough houses in the capital, we could meet the annual national quota with room to spare and prevent speculative greenbelt development in the home counties and around the country, such as areas where we represent. So, if we want a planning system that works with local people, we do need to take a step back and look at our landscape and ask ourselves about those incentives that are driving those unfavourable outcomes. We take the politics out of this. We're talking about human nature and human behaviour, and it is an illustration of the tragedy of the commons. Projects such as solar farms are needed to reach communal goals such as net zero, and most people agree that renewable energy is a good idea. So, yes, I will. Yep.
Right about strategic overview. Would you not agree with me that one thing we need is a national policy on solar farms? Does the government want them to be on out in the middle of the countryside and large scale, or does it want to be smaller sites? At the moment, there is no national policy for the matter. Should there not be one brought in with no further delay?
I strongly agree with my right honourable friend. He's completely right, and I think most of us will be making the same point, and I'm sure the Minister will update us. I just want to say a few brief words about environmental issues, if the House will indulge me for a couple more minutes, because we do need to talk about the environmental agencies which exist and the proliferating plethora of reasons for objecting to development on environmental grounds. Now, we have a number of agencies, most notably Natural England and the Environment Agency and others. But what we haven't seen them doing anything useful, such as protecting farmland or our green space or our precious environment or nature to tackle projects such as we're all concerned about in our local areas. No, what are they actually doing? They are inventing and coming up with ridiculous ideas like nutrient neutrality, which in fact is holding up 100,000 much-needed houses all across the country where people are screaming out for them and they're desperate for them. And guess who voted against the proposals that we brought forward to tackle that? Well, of course, it was Labour. So perhaps if they were serious about unblocking development and house building, they could have acted on that. Look, I accept that there's a need for regulation and enforcement, but we should direct our attention to this huge number of quangos and agencies who are indulging in mission creep way outside what was originally envisaged. We have woken up and found that the ECHR is now regulating about climate change for some people in Switzerland, saying it's violating their human rights. Now, look, we believe in conserving. That's what Conservatives do. But we should focus on conserving plants, trees, nature, wildlife, landscapes and greenbelt, not ever enlarging highly paid bureaucratic jobs. These are people that always want to conserve their own organisation and the multitude of rules and regulations. We need to go back to our core Conservative values and ask why we have allowed the state to create so many of these laws. We can't really blame people for using the protections that we've given them. So that, again, is human nature, and that is why we need to go back, I think, to the drawing board with the way that we are using our land. I will conclude, Mr Henderson, by thanking again the House for holding this debate. It's a complex and lengthy subject, but to come back for the avoidance of doubt, I oppose the proposals in my constituency. I recognise there are no easy soundbite answers, but my constituents deserve to be listened to. I will be a voice to them. They cannot be denigrated for standing up for their local area, for caring about it. My right honourable friend for Houghton, has made the point eloquently that that's why they moved to the area. They worked very hard, they saved up, they bought a house, they moved to a desirable area, and we are their voice, and we will fight for that.
Yeah.
Rick Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Henderson. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I start by thanking and congratulating my honourable friend for Sleaford and North Hykeham for bringing this incredibly important debate to many counties around the country that have been mentioned so far, not least Buckinghamshire. Since I was elected in 2019, the threat of large-scale solar developments has caused significant concern for me and my constituents. Across my Buckingham constituency, field after field and farm after farm have already been blanketed by solar panels to the detriment of the surrounding communities, food security, nature and our beautiful landscape. And whilst we must strive towards a more sustainable and secure energy strategy, this does not and cannot include the huge sacrifice of agricultural land we have already made and many plan to make in pursuit of that lofty goal. Within the 335 square miles of rural Buckinghamshire that I am lucky enough to represent, a total of 3,600 acres of land has been either allocated to or planned for solar farms. That is 1.5 times larger than the entirety of Heathrow Airport. The largest proposed industrial solar installation alone, Rosefield, that sits amongst the villages known as the Claydons, dwarfs the size of the nearby town of Buckingham, a town of over 10,000 residents. It is not an exaggeration to say that the Buckinghamshire countryside is slowly being consumed by solar panels. And does this benefit anybody locally? No, it does not. Not when we consider the construction impact, the visual impact, the risk to wildlife, the risk to the local economy, our tourism economy. Buckinghamshire is lucky enough to have stunning, beautiful countryside that people come to walk through and then spend their money in our cafes and bars and hotels and campsites. I'm not sure that they will still want to do that if the landscape is just covered in the glass and metal and plastic that these solar farms have. Not, of course, that the promoters of such schemes, such as Rosefield in the Claydons, Callies near Alswick, Bourton in Buckingham, Redborough in Ledburn, many, many others I could mention. Not that those developers care about any of those points. And does it benefit our country? No. Not when our food security is at grave risk of being severely compromised, as my honourable friend for Sleaford and North Hykeham has already outlined, through the enormous loss of agricultural land that when taken together, when taken cumulatively, each of these developments represents. No matter how big or small, all agricultural land repurposed is not only food lost, but also livelihoods lost. Land which would have been farmed for generations beforehand, too often by tenant farmers, who are given no choice but to leave without any meaningful say in the process, or indeed any compensation. To achieve the set target of 70 gigawatts from solar installations by 2035, more than 300...
Before he leaves the point of tenant farmers,
I will gladly give way to my honourable friend.
My honourable friend is making a brilliant speech and a very good point on tenant farmers. Is not one of the problems that the way we have set up the pricing of these mechanisms is it renders tenant farmers completely uneconomic. And so if you are some foreign investor with vast investments in the British countryside, it's in your interest to throw them out in favour of this policy.
As ever, my right honourable friend hits the nail precisely on the head, and the risk to tenant farmers through the pricing mechanisms that we're seeing, through the sheer plain economics of it, is severely stacked against their interests. And actually, when you look at the volume of farms in this country that are tenanted rather than owned, the more of the tenant farms we lose, the greater the slide in domestic food security we will see. And the current number of around 60% of self-sufficiency will drop very rapidly indeed. So my right honourable friend is absolutely right in what he says. Now, to achieve the set target of the 70 gigawatts from solar installations by 2035, more than 300,000 acres across the country would be required for solar installations. And it's no secret that the rural economy, under pressure, for example, from rising input prices and many other things, has already faced significant challenges in recent years. Left with no viable options, some have been forced to sell their land or leave their land, and in the process guaranteeing that it will almost certainly never return to food-producing status. Yet across all of those estates, all those farms, all that land, the barn roofs are empty and blank. Now, smaller standalone solar is less impactful, quicker and easier to install, does not risk damaging the local infrastructure, and provides additional reliable source of income for struggling farms. I'm in no way saying that farmers with maybe 10, 20, 30 acres of unproductive land shouldn't be able, in consultation with their local planning authority and local communities, be able to utilise some of that land that isn't useful for producing food anymore for small scale. They should be able to put it on their rooftops. But the fundamental point that I really want to make is that no amount of solar is actually going to revive the fortunes of some of those farms that are indeed struggling. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Time and time again, I hear the baseless argument, and it's a point that has been developed already in this debate, from developers that anything less than grade 3A land should be given over because they believe it now to be incapable of growing any meaningful food. And I fundamentally disagree with that point. Grade 3B land can in fact be very productive, and I know that because the bulk of my constituency that sits in the Vale of Aylesbury sits on blue clay, and that means the vast majority of it gets a grade 3B land rating. But it remains perfectly capable in many, many cases, having been nurtured and loved and looked after for generations, perfectly capable of producing 10-tonne a hectare wheat harvests, which actually many farmers I know in other parts of the country on grade 2 land, maybe even grade 1 land, would bite your right hand off to get that sort of yield at harvest time. I would delighted.
Let's go from my own friend to be very generous with his time. He makes an extremely important point about this definition of grade 3 and grade 3B. Most people know anything about the countryside know that one field may well be half 3A and half 3B. I'm told that Natural England do not have a map. They don't even have a clear definition as to what is 3A and 3B. Would not agree with me that the worst outrage of all is that when these speculative solar farm developers come along, it is their surveyor, they pay the surveyor, who decides on the quality of the land. Hardly surprisingly, they find in favour of it all being 3B.
My right honourable friend is absolutely right on that point. It's almost as if he had been looking over my shoulder and seeing what was on the next page of my speech, because it is a point that I am precisely coming to, because it is clear that the overpaid surveyors, the so-called experts who come in with a very clear mandate of what it is they have to do, have been hired to test soil quality. They don't even go out into the middle of the field. They don't go out into the most versatile part of the farm where the crop actually grows, because we have caught them red-handed in Buckinghamshire testing the headland, testing the very edge of the field. And you are always going to get a lower score from that test if you haven't gone to the bit of the field where the crop actually grows. They are deliberately testing the edge of fields. They are deliberately testing the headland to get that poorer quality result. And because it wouldn't be a speech from me without mentioning this, it is the same tactic that HS2's contractors use in other parts of my constituency to get similar results, to prove similar points. It is not something that is unique to the solar developers. I would be delighted.
The land results proposed by the surveyors and the maps that DEFRA produce of what they expect the land to be, and notice the differences?
My honourable friend makes a very powerful point. Yes, time and time again you see a differential between what the developer's own surveyor, what the developer's own consultant comes up with and what we believe the land to be. I preface that a little bit with the comment I made for much of my constituency sitting on that blue clay base, that we do expect a lot of it to be 3B. However, I come back to the point that I made, that 3B land actually can be very productive land and very good land, producing the sort of yields that I talked about. It is how that land has been farmed, often for generations, that dictates how good it is for food production and not other things. Now, 60% of farms in the UK, a point I made earlier, are indeed tenant farms. But beyond that, it's not just the farmers, it's not just the tenants, it's not just those that are employed in those farms that hurt when that land is taken away from food production. The packing plants, the equipment suppliers, the distributors, a huge part of our rural economy and national economy is hit when food production is diminished. And for the surrounding communities, the loss of farmland by no means starts or ends with the solar panels. Take the Claydons, for example, where my constituents have suffered hugely from large-scale construction already, including a number of big housing estates, East West Rail, the ultimate destroyer, HS2. It is a daily struggle for them getting to work, school, the hospital, the GPs, or the shops, without coming up against the obstacles of endless road closures, broken stretches of road which have become dangerous after thousands of HGV movements, drivers travelling to from nearby compounds, and severe light pollution during the winter months. And that will be all the same all over again with the construction of these huge solar farms. 2,100 acres of solar farm is not built overnight. They're all put on concrete bases. There will be piling in places. That construction impact is considerable on local communities. And so after all the disruption my constituents have already taken and are taking from those big national infrastructure projects, this once quiet corner of Buckinghamshire is now expected to take, in the case of Rosefield, a 2,100 acre development, actually dwarfing the amount of land High Speed 2 has taken in Buckinghamshire. So it's not unreasonable to expect that given the extent of the proposed site, we would see yet more of the same disruption that has plagued the Claydons for years. And all of this comes without any commitment by the promoters to fix any of the damaged roads, which are already having to be patched by the council, even though when other people have broken them. It is simply not fair for my constituents and areas like the Claydons to foot all that pain all over again. And it's not just the panels which consume vast amounts of countryside. The infrastructure needed to carry the electricity generated through to the grid swallows up yet more. And it is no coincidence that adjacent to the proposed Rosefield site, there's a proposed battery storage facility, equivalent of 90 shipping containers of battery storage right next door. More food-producing land being sacrificed, and the facility itself poses a major fire risk in an area where the emergency services are already struggling in the face of such disruptive amounts of construction work to get to any emergencies that occur. So let that be a warning, Mr. Henderson, to any community where solar is coming. It doesn't just end up in the solar panels. And of course, there is no community benefit whatsoever from solar development, whether large or small. No cheap electricity, as has already been said, for local residents or businesses. No support systems in place for those impacted by construction. No recourse for anybody affected. I've spoken a lot about Rosefield, and I just want to briefly talk about some other large-scale solar developments in my constituency. In the south of my constituency, we've seen an equally blatant tactic of admittedly slightly smaller scale, but still significant ground-based solar installations being installed or proposed just metres from each other. Take the proposed solar installation near the village of Kimblewick on the eastern side of the village of Ford, or Callis Solar Farm on the western side of the village of Ford, which combined would actually be the second largest land take in my constituency after Rosefield for these ground-mounted panels. This is a tactic we have seen time and time again, which puts community and local authority resources under strain, in turn diminishing their influence over the whole planning process. We have got to find a way to ensure the cumulative impact of solar farms are taken into account.
I'm very grateful to him giving way, and my apologies I wasn't able to be here at the beginning of the debate. I was speaking in the chamber and hence will not participate in a full speech, but would be very grateful to be able to make a comment. And he describes exactly the situation that my constituents in Roundel face themselves, with multiple applications being made for adjoining pieces of land, all of which are small scale and therefore to be decided by the local district council rather than to be decided by the Secretary of State. They feel that this is an abusive way of applying, of putting in solar farms, which will cumulatively be a very large development. Would he agree with me that perhaps the government needs to have a pause on all applications of this variety being granted and urge district councils to have the appropriate training that they need so that they can identify and fully measure the cumulative impact of these developments?
I'm grateful to my rightable friend for that intervention. I do agree with her. I think there should be this fundamental pause on any solar application being able to take land used in food production. As the new National Planning and Policy Framework was being negotiated concurrent to the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, now Act, I was pleased to be able to persuade the Secretary of State for DLUC to change some of the language in the NPPF from the old language of best and most versatile to, and it was hidden in a footnote, but it is still there, to a straightforward definition of land used in food production. And so if we can leverage that as the test that planning authorities now do have through the NPPF, coupled with the very sensible points my rightable friend just made of going up in the helicopter and doing a review of all land being taken and pausing any decisions, I think that would bring a lot of relief to communities, certainly mine in Buckinghamshire, and I'm sure hers in Staffordshire, and many others as well. Solar does have its place, but that place is on rooftops and not fields. Across my constituency are farms and industrial sites where the roofs of barns and warehouses are devoid of solar panels. My constituency adjoins both Bicester to the Oxfordshire side and Milton Keynes to the northeast. Many, many thousands of rooftops of distribution centres and warehouses and these big sheds that are going up as logistics hubs everywhere, vibrantly adding to our economic development, but with no solar on the roof. If we just got the solar panels on those roofs instead, I think we would actually find we would have more than enough space to ensure that we are indeed delivering on the volume of solar generated energy that we need. Research from CPRE has found that there is a potential for 117 gigawatts of renewable energy to be generated from rooftops and other existing developed spaces in England alone, substantially more than the master target. So rooftop solar systems have to be the priority for government, and I would urge my honourable friend the Minister, when he replies, to find a way of ensuring that our solar strategy is a rooftop strategy and not an agricultural land strategy. My honourable friend, and I will conclude in one or two moments, Mr Henderson, I'm aware of the time I've taken. My honourable friend, as she opened this debate, made the point about small modular reactors. She even quoted a statistic I have used in the past, and it is one that I think actually goes to the absolute nub of this debate. The absolute clearest argument I can make about what is a sensible land use strategy. And that is this point, that the small modular reactors we have seen companies like Rolls-Royce develop need virtually no land to deliver significantly more power. My honourable friend was kind to quote me earlier, but I will repeat the statistic because I'm quite fond of it. 2,000 acres of solar panels to produce on current usage, before everyone's got 2 Teslas on the drive, but on current usage, 50,000 homes worth of electricity. A small modular reactor, 2 football pitches, 1 million homes powered from the back of that. That surely has to be the more sensible use of land in this country, where we can power people's homes, we can power people's businesses, we can do so in that clean and wonderful way that nuclear can deliver, while still having national food security. Those numbers must surely speak volumes to anybody that cares about both energy security and about food security in our wonderful country. So, my clear asks as I conclude. We simply must diversify our national energy security strategy to promote less land-intensive schemes that come at the expense of our food security, promote the development of other more reliable, sustainable and less impactful schemes we can actually deliver every day of the year. Secondly, put in practice the provision that I spoke about a few moments ago of the new language in the NPPF and encourage local authorities to actually use it. And 3, incentivise the use of existing rooftop space for standalone solar installations on sites which already have a grid connection, and to reform the grid to ensure many more can as well. So, Mr Henderson, let's get this right. Stop the solar destruction. Build our energy security on nuclear, protect our food security, and save the great British countryside.
Mr Henderson, thank you very much for calling me. Can I first of all say, my honourable friend for Buckingham has said it all. That was the most powerful and inclusive speech, covered most of the ground really superbly well. I congratulate him for it. But prior to that, my honourable friend for, I always get the name wrong, it's West Sleaford and North Hykeham. I congratulate her on calling this a very, very important debate, this extremely important moment in this time. And the way she laid the whole case out was masterful, I may say. So it really was an extremely good speech, and I thank them both for it. I'll try not to repeat what they had to say. Mr Henderson, we are, I think, it seems to be at a tipping point in this whole debate. Within the last few days, I've noted a few very interesting remarks by the government on this whole question of large-scale solar. On Tuesday, in answer to a question from me, my honourable friend, the Minister, who replied to the debate, commented that he thought that the question of large-scale solar was, quote, a very interesting topic and one that we're listening to. I think one that we're listening to is an important thing for a government minister to say. And may I congratulate him on having the courage and the conviction to come out onto Parliament Square a moment ago to see many of my constituents who are out there complaining against the Limedown solar farm proposed in my constituency. And I think that demonstrates how he is ready, definitely, to listen. And I'm sure he will have noted how many Conservative members of Parliament there are here in the chamber today, and how few from other constituencies. It's a huge issue for all of us. That same day, I'm delighted to say that my honourable friend, the member for Swindon North, who's now, of course, an Energy Minister, I congratulate him on his promotion, said, and I quote again during question time, he said, solar projects should be directed to previously developed or non-greenfield sites. Very straightforward remark from the Minister. And then again on Prime Minister question time yesterday, the Prime Minister said, we do not want to see more solar on greenfield sites. It's the cheapest form of energy, but we want to see it on brownfield sites, rooftops, and away from our agricultural land. So in 1 week, Mr Henderson, we've seen 3 ministers, including the Prime Minister, actually stipulating, agreeing with the points that we here in this room are trying to make today. My instinct is that we're at a tipping point, and the government have realised that what they've actually achieved is a huge concreting over of our countryside, very largely conservative represented constituencies like mine, and they're beginning to realise that's actually an enormous political mistake. Incidentally, I was very much encouraged by a recent report from the Planning Inspectorate on a planning application for large solar in Bedfordshire, and I quote, the Secretary of State agrees that this solar farm will result in large change to the character of the land, which would impinge upon the openness of the green belt. He believes that it would have a significant adverse effect on the spatial and visual qualities of the green fields, and development on the site would be visible in the wider landscape, would be harmful to purpose, would be encroachment on the countryside as defined under planning law. So it does seem to me that the planning inspectorate as well as ministers are beginning to realise that this is going wrong. The NPPF, which I very much welcome, broadly speaking, didn't quite follow the arguments with regard to large-scale solar, and I do think maybe the Minister is going to have to consider redesigning the NPPF in some detail after this debate and after the other debates that we're just about to engage on. Mr Henderson, I'm ready to work with, I think there are something like 40 colleagues who have large-scale solar farms in their constituencies, and I'm certainly ready to work with them on a national basis. But as other colleagues have said today, there's nothing wrong at all with being a NIMBY. And I want to focus, if I may, for my brief remarks, on a new application that's been produced in a place called Limedown in my own constituency. And incidentally, can we please say to these PR spin doctors that work for the developers, calling things like, using names like Limedown and Poplar's Ash and Bird's Leaves to try and disguise the fact that these are in fact industrialisation of the countryside won't work. And anyhow, they have used the word Limedown in my own constituency. And now, this particular application, and many of my colleagues who've spoken today have similar experiences, will be some 2,000 acres of panels themselves, plus a further 2,000 or 3,000 acres which will be blighted because they're in between the different patches, plus something like 30-mile connection down the road to Melksham, which is the substation in Melksham, which is the nearest bit of the grid that we can get to. This will be an absolutely 3 million panels. 3 million panels. Just think of the HGVs that we require to get them into the middle of the countryside. We're talking about a bit of countryside, the Cotswolds. It runs down the historic Roman Fossway. Some of the finest buildings, some of the finest farms in the land, and some of the finest landscape in the land will be blighted by this application. So we're totally opposed to it. And I called a public meeting the other day in Malmesbury Town Hall. I was delighted that 750 people came to it. Not many of my colleagues can remember a pro meeting with 750 people at it. They turned up. These people are extremely angry at what's being proposed for the so-called Limedown area, and I was delighted they took the trouble to come to the meeting that evening. This is a huge, huge, huge issue in my constituency, and we must see what we can do to stop it. Now, if I may just differentiate ourselves very slightly from some of my colleagues, we in Wiltshire are already taking our fair share of solar. 8 of the largest solar farms in England, I suspect probably Europe, are in Wiltshire, and most of them in the north half of Wiltshire, my constituency. We have 54 solar farms all told in production already. We have our target for the county is 570 megawatts. We're already doing 590 megawatts. We've exceeded our county target already. We have 2 or 3 very large-scale ones like Lynham, for example, where 250 acres, and Rawton, the former RAF Rawton, again, something like 200 acres of solar farms. So we're already making a huge contribution to the national effort towards solar. And this 2,000 acres now that's been proposed for Limedown just busts the target entirely and is wholly unacceptable to the people in my area. They're particularly upset by the fact, and it's been referred to by 1 or 2 of my colleagues already, that this is not an environmental matter. This is not some effort to try and save the globe. This is funded by Macquarie, an Australian funding house. Macquarie, the so-called kangaroo vampires, responsible most recently for Thames Water. Not a great success, Mrs. Macquarie. And actually, the fact that they are behind this demonstrates it's simply about money. The compensation which they're proposing for farmers is alone £80 million. We estimate the cost of getting the link through to the substation a further £25 million. They'll spend £100 million before they built 1 panel. So we're talking about a multi-billion-pound investment here for very substantial returns for the Wall Street spivs who stand behind it. And actually, I just don't think the people of Wiltshire should allow that to occur. These are people not there for environmental reasons at all. They may claim to be, and they claim to be biodiversity friendly and all that stuff. It's absolute PR spin, total nonsense. They are there because there's an enormous amount of money in it. And I don't see why we should compromise our environmental principles by allowing these people to come into our countryside and to do what they propose to do. So, Mr. Henderson, the 2 or 3 things I think most of the salient points have been made by my colleagues, but I think the reasons why we don't want it are because of the landscape, and nothing can be finer than the South Cotswolds, which is my own constituency, so the landscape must be preserved. Food security, several of my honourable friends have already spoken about this very passionately, but it's absolutely right. Why should it be that at the moment we are a very productive agricultural area, mainly beef and sheep and pigs to a degree, and quite a bit of arable too, but why should it be that we give that up in favour of solar, in favour of energy security, when actually the contribution that solar makes to energy security is extremely small, some 3%, I think it is, of national electricity produced by solar, of course.
I'm very grateful to my uncle friend for giving way. There is another choice. that needs to be made when it comes to solar, and that is the use of slave labour in many of the production of many of the solar panels and the materials that go into the solar panels. We shouldn't have to make a choice between being environmentally friendly and respecting human rights and ensuring that forced labour is not active in supply chains.
My right honourable friend makes an extremely good point, and I think made earlier this week in the House, if I remember rightly, that we believe that Uyghur slave labour is being used in China for production of these panels. They're then being shipped here in huge ships, then they get onto lorries, and we're environmentally extremely unfriendly in their production. Let's hear another thing that's extremely unfriendly. They say that in 40 years' time, the solar farm will no longer be used. They say that it'll all be taken down, demolished. They say that it'll be returned to agriculture at that time. Well, two or three things about that, Mr. Henderson, if I may. First, the chances of Messrs. Macquarie still being here and living up to that promise are extremely remote. These farms are sold week after week after week. They're sold from one financial house to the next financial house. The chance in 40 years' time of some nice company coming along and saying, oh, thanks very much, North Wiltshire, you've done your stuff. Now we're going to take these things away and then return to where it was. The chances are zero. Absolutely, it cannot possibly happen, particularly because in the meantime, the likelihood is that the technology will move forward. Very probably, in 5 or 10 years' time, these things will be out of date, and who will then remove them? Who will then remediate the land? Nobody. There will be no such person to do it.
Will you give way on that point?
Of course.
Just wondering whether you're making a very good point about the obsolescence of these products over time. I wonder if he has any electrical appliances in his home, or is he aware of any that have lasted 40 years and still been useful after that?
There is a very interesting correspondence to the Telegraph at the moment, actually, about household items that are surviving for 40 years, but precious few. And then what do you do? How do you dispose of them? Because that's the other great problem with these things. There is no known means of disposing of them, even if it did happen that they were being restored after 40 years or after 20 years. There is no known means under national planning policy of disposing of them. Do they go to landfill? What happens to them? Nobody seems to know. There is no known solution to it. We're doing something which our descendants will curse us for by covering the countryside in these vast vanity mirrors with no known means of remediation when we're long dead and our grandchildren and grandchildren are inheriting them. And what a mess that will be. And I'll tell you what will then happen, incidentally. Some planner will say, fine, it's a brownfield site now, so now what we do is turn it into a new town or turn it into a factory or turn it into something else we don't want. So I think the whole way in which these things are created seems to me to be very worrying. I think the point about the Uyghur slave labour is extremely important, and the disposal of them at the end of the time, I think, is something which hasn't yet been answered. The two or three asks, if I may, of the Minister when he comes to reply to the debate, I think which we really need to focus on with a sort of laser-sharp attention to detail. The first is this question of the quality of land that is being used, or being allowed to be used for these solar farms. When the Right Honourable Gentleman, who was then the Secretary of State for Agriculture, whose constituency in Devon, Cornwall, appeared before the Environmental Audit Committee, which I serve, I pressed him on this particular point about a year ago now. He said, oh yes, it definitely 3A and 3B would not be used for solar. And I asked him 3 or 4 times, he reiterated, he said, absolutely. I made that plain, I'm the Secretary for DEFRA, I've made absolutely plain 3A and 3B may not be used for solar. Now, unfortunately, he then had to write to me about a couple of weeks later to say actually he'd made a small mistake, and officials had picked him up on it, and actually he realised now that only 3A was necessarily not going to be used, and 3B and so. But nonetheless, the fact that at the time the Secretary for DEFRA thought it was all grade 3 land is of itself important. And we talked a moment ago about the fact that this land is being judged by, or being surveyed by people paid by the developers, and hardly surprisingly they find in favour of it, and that they're going around the headland rather than the productive centre of the field is, of course, itself extraordinary. And anyhow, 3A and 3B are both productive agricultural land, and I think we must find a way of examining precisely how that's defined, but what exactly what the mapping is. I'm told that English Nature actually don't have a map of where 3A and 3B land is at the moment, and they should do, and they don't even have a clear definition as to what they are. So we need some laser focus on the kind of land that we allow solar farms to be on. The second thing that I'd like to hear from the Minister later on, if we can, would be this question of the cumulative effect of solar farms. As my right honourable friend from Shropshire, Staffordshire said, that there are many small applications which put together come to a very large one. Well, I slightly disagree with her. I'd rather my district council or my county council were deciding on the matter, because at least it's local. Whereas if it's one of these vast ones, it's done by the Secretary of State, that we have no way of countering it. But she's quite right in saying that put them all together, it comes to a much bigger thing than any of them individually. And therefore, the cumulative effect of solar farm applications seems to me to be something the government might like to give some thought to, as to whether or not they can strengthen the presumption against the cumulative totality coming to more than they would otherwise allow. And the third thing, which I'd like quite like a comment I made from the government, with this question of grid capacity. I'm told that actually, particularly in the southwest and Wiltshire, the grid has already neared its capacity. There is no more room for solar farms going into it. Nonetheless, speculative developers apply for planning to get it, apply for planning permission to do it. They then sell that planning permission, sell the options they have available to other speculators, despite the fact that the grid cannot actually take the electricity. So this is a financial shenanigans. This is a fiddling around with the money to try and say, we've got planning permission on this 2,000 acres of North Wiltshire, and we now want to sell it to you next financial shenanigans individual, because you never know, maybe down the road it'll work. But they know perfectly well that actually there is no capacity in the grid. So again, I think the government ought to pay some attention to whether or not capacity in the grid could of itself be a pertinent factor in considering these applications. Now, I know that the Minister is standing in a quasi-judicial position, and that he can't actually comment, particularly not during this period of PERDA lead up to the local governments. He cannot comment on any individual application or any particular site, and I respect that very much. But I hope that he will have understood the power of feeling amongst all Conservative colleagues, many of them who are not here, and incidentally, many of them, of course, are ministers and may feel constrained. My right honourable friend, the member for Chippenham, I know, feels equally very strongly on the subject of the Limedown application, but of course can't say so perhaps publicly, but I did clear with her beforehand that I could mention in passing. A great many of my colleagues, I think, feel very strongly on this issue indeed. And I hope that the efforts of the last couple of weeks will have brought home to the Minister what a very, very, very important issue this is, how very strongly the Conservative Party and Conservative members of Parliament feel about it. And I hope very much that in the next few months available to him, he'll find ways of bringing in some of these changes, whether it be on cumulative effect, whether it be on land supply, whether it be on the general principle of solar. I hope that he'll find ways of bringing in nudges to the inspectorate to say these are the things that ministers believe should or should not happen, so the inspectorate will then be more inclined to turn a thing down rather than, at the moment, they're rather inclined to accept it.
Yeah. I congratulate my honourable friend and neighbour for Sleaford and North Hykeham for the very comprehensive way she introduced this debate. These proposals for huge solar farms, and they're not farms at all, of course, that's a misnomer. These proposals are unwise, unwelcome, and they undermine our countryside. The opposition to them in my constituency and increasingly up and down the country is as widespread as it is deeply felt. I know many friends and colleagues will have the same experience. And as we've said again and again, we're not opposed to solar energy. Offshore wind and rooftop solar are entirely welcome. As I've travelled up and down between Westminster and West Lindsey, the motorways, the A1, they're lined with giant logistics and distribution centres. Flat rooftops like these are perfect for solar panels. As my honourable friend said, there are perhaps 600,000 acres of south-facing roofs which we could put solar panels on. And of course, there are manufacturing and brownfield sites too. Taking such a vast amount of good land out of agricultural production is incredibly short-sighted. As my right honourable friend, the member for South Holland the Deepings, argued in a debate on this subject 2 years ago, we should not build a single solar panel on good farmland until we have panels on every large building. We in Lincolnshire, as my honourable friend for Sleaford has made clear, are the breadbasket of England. As she said, we produce 12% of the total food that we eat. We want to safeguard in Lincolnshire that living tradition. As we all know, the planning framework has presumption against building these panels on land graded 1, 2 and 3A. Now, I met with my honourable friend for South Holland. We met with the Prime Minister yesterday, the two of us, asking him to extend that protection to 3B. And I was in the same question time in the Chamber earlier this week in which I was making the same point. And we got reassurance, did we not, I say to my honourable friend, on the floor of the House, that it was never the intention of the government to build on good agricultural land. And I know the Minister is very limited in what he has to say, but as my honourable friend has just said, in the remaining months available to him as a Minister in this government, we just have to act to end this scandal of these solar panels being put on 3B land. It simply is not acceptable. So food distribution networks worldwide still face disruption thanks to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. As Matt Ridley has pointed out in the Telegraph this month, the UK is currently vying with the intensive agriculture of New Zealand in terms of wheat yield. Britain's combination of moist soil and long summer days is perfect for growing wheat, as we well know in Lincolnshire. How will this be affected if we shift from useful and nourishing food to unreliable energy production? And when people say this is green, what is more green than actually converting sunlight into food? And that's what our farms do. How will this be affected if we shift from useful and nourishing food to unreliable energy production? The quantity of land involved is staggering. The journalist Robert Bryce has discovered that solar panels typically need about 200 times the amount of land to generate an equivalent energy output as gas. Britain has and always will be a maritime power, a trading nation, an agricultural producer. We can't produce everything we consume, but the more we do, the better off we are and the greater our food security is. Do we really think that turfing out tenant farmers who may have been there for 200 years in their families, good people, solid people, turfing out tenant farmers, and they have no right, by the way, they can be turfed out, they have no rights in this. Do we believe that turfing them out to build solar panels on the behest of entrepreneurs from London on thousands and thousands of acres of arable land is a good idea? And what's so unfair about this is that the rewards to some very large landowners are absolutely staggering. £100,000 on 100 acres. Is it surprising that all these people are being bought off? It is, and when they say this is not subsidised, of course it's subsidised. It's subsidised by green levies. So somebody living on a living wage in a terraced house in Gainsborough is paying for their energy to put it in the pockets of entrepreneurs and huge landowners earning £100,000 on just 100 acres a year. It is not green, it is not fair, and it is not right. Meanwhile, our typically wet British weather means we have occasionally had to fire up the coal plants to meet the country's energy needs, as we know. It's not just in rain and cloud, but sometimes even when the sun is shining. We all know that for much of the year, of course, when it's dark, solar panels don't work. But actually, people assume that they work fantastically well in the summer. Not necessarily. Last summer, we had a sweltering week that led to an uptick in energy demand. People turned on their air conditioning, plugged in their fans. Solar panels tend to be optimised for 25 degrees Celsius. In a summer heat wave with temperatures of 30 degrees or more, the amount of energy solar panels contribute decreases. How bizarre. So everybody assumes that these things are wonderful when the sun is shining, not necessarily on the hottest days, just when we need it most. Solar is useful, but simply cannot be relied on. Keeping a massive gas-powered infrastructure on hand is a necessary component of this solar-powered system. But solar on its own is hugely expensive. Ecologists have become more and more aware of the importance of embodied energy. This is not a point that's been made yet. The usage that goes into the building or manufacture of something. One of the green arguments we had against tearing down Richmond House over there while the Palace of Westminster is renovated is that it is in demolishing not just a listed building, but one that is perfectly usable, just decades old, and with decades left of its natural cycle is not a green thing to do. There is no clear evidence that the embodied energy involved in constructing these massive solar panel projects will ever be made back during a 15-year life cycle before they are replaced or removed. When you take embodied energy into account, it is very doubtful that these huge proposals are, in fact, sustainable or green. Massive solar panel installations have the potential to send property values plunging. And I so like the way that my honourable friends have argued this debate, that actually these people are people who put their life savings into their homes. Why have they not got the right to defend their homes? I mean, they're accused of being NIMBYs, but they are simply good people defending often quite modest lifestyles in our rural economy. The beautiful landscapes of England are under threat, not to mention the holiday-let industry, which has grown immensely across the country and is currently surviving. The net effect on tourism in Lincolnshire and across England will be negative. We should be fostering and encouraging this sector across the counties of England, not stifling it. The inspiration behind solar panel installations is not environmental altruism, has already been made. It's just naked profit. Nothing wrong with people wanting to be entrepreneurs, nothing wrong with people wanting to make profit, but not at the expense of the British countryside. We need greater prosperity and spread around the United Kingdom, but these proposals are backed by faceless global investment firms that are relying upon us, in effect, to sign them a blank cheque. It's not the government's job to do that. We have to be the custodians of this land and its people and its history. That includes our countryside, our farming sector, our environment, our landscapes. Land-intensive, low-output solar installations are not the solution. In fact, they only create more problems. Solar undoubtedly has a part to play in energy production. We need a diverse energy setup in this country, but the government needs to build more power plants and replace ones that are coming offline. We need more nuclear, for example. We have been dragging our heels while France has been a marvel on this front. When the oil crisis hit Europe in 1973, Pierre Mesmer was the French Prime Minister. He was determined that a great nation like France must be able to look after its energy needs. At the time, most of France's electricity was generated thanks to foreign oil. Mesmer rolled out a massive program of building nuclear power stations to provide cheap, clean energy. France is now much more globally competitive for business because of nuclear power. The regulated unit price of electricity in France last year was 53% of that of the UK. In France, he said, and I'm quoting, "We do not have oil, but we do have ideas." So, Minister, let's just try and do this. Let's just have some good ideas and not try and just build over our countryside. Here in the UK, we have North Sea oil and we have North Sea gas. Let us have ideas too that are cheap, reliable energy from nuclear and gas. Solar and wind can top this up, but they can't replace it. Another astonishing thing about these proposals is just how scant the offering is in terms of community gain. Virtually nothing to my constituents. The arrogance of all this is extraordinary. There's almost no benefit to the local community tied to these large-scale proposals. I suspect this is because the solar firms are skipping the normal planning process, and this is a point which we've made many times already in this debate, by applying for them as nationally significant infrastructure projects, instead of being determined locally by our district councils. They've also divided the applications into many smaller ones, even though each is useless unless part of a major offering. Now, I've argued before the Planning Inspectorate that the collective impact of these proposals is colossal, and each individual application can only be evaluated accurately as part of the whole. I've attended the public inquiries for West Burton and Cotham. I've argued my case. In the vicinity of the small town of Gainsborough, within a radius of just 6 miles, it is proposed to cover 10,000 acres of agricultural land. Within a radius of just 6 miles, near Gainsborough, 10,000 acres, with the local authority having absolutely no say, nor local people. This is entirely wrong. And when I've gone in person to argue on behalf of my constituents, the highly paid barristers and solicitors paid for by these entrepreneurs from London say, "Well, I'm sorry, we're only doing what the government wants." So it's now for the minister, in the time available to him, to step in and save our people. This energy will go straight into the national grid, have no local benefit, will not reduce energy costs for local people. These proposals are taking up too much land for the energy output they produce. They are taking thousands and thousands of acres out of good land out of agriculture, undermining farming and food security. They will erect eyesores that will lessen the beauty of our natural landscapes and undermine local tourism. They are cheating the system by skipping the normal planning scrutiny provided by democratically accountable local decision makers. The primary benefit will be to faceless international companies rather than to locals here. These vulture firms are attempting to gobble up our countryside. The government must say no. There's a very simple step. It's been said again and again, I emphasise it now. All the minister has to do, you don't need legislation, you have to say that you cannot build these things on grade 3B land. You talk to any farmer in Lincolnshire and they will say there is absolutely no difference in terms of production between 3A and 3B. And we want this to be independently verified. As my honourable friend from Buckinghamshire said, we do not want dodgy agronomists going around pretending that this is 3A land. There's virtually no difference. So you don't build them on 3B and you have it independently verified. And we want to have some sort of planning guidance available to the inspector to make sure that whilst we can cope with some solar panel development, there cannot be something on the scale of 10,000 acres within 6 miles. So very simple steps that the minister needs to take, and he needs to do it urgently. I end by mentioning my honourable friend for Cleethorpes was sitting here earlier. In the Civil War, on the margins of our two constituencies was the Battle of Ryby Gap, where the pesky parliamentarians tried to displace the noble royalists from that part of Lincolnshire. The royalists fought and they won, and in Lincolnshire we will fight and we will win.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Henson. Firstly, can I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Sleaford and North Hykeham, for getting this debate. It's been very apparent listening to it quite how important an issue it is. She made a brilliant and comprehensive speech, and others following her have pretty much filled in all the details. So I'm going to be fairly brief in my response, my follow-up now. The current policy on large-scale solar farms fails to take into account the country's landscape and environment. My right honourable friend, the member for Ludlow, said earlier in intervention on my honourable friend that this is a matter of balance. He was exactly right. And this policy is badly designed and does not deliver any sense of balance whatsoever. Largely, I suspect, because of the dead hand of the Treasury in it, but I'll come back to that in a moment. And we've heard a series of horror stories, the latest from my honourable friend, an old friend from Gainsborough. I sat here with a sense of horror when he talked about 10,000 acres under these nightmarish destroyers of the countryside. And of course, the government's National Infrastructure Tracker shows 26 of these huge projects. And I have one. I have one very close to me, put up by a company called Boom Power in East Yorkshire. And it covers 3,500 acres. One project alone, 3,500 acres. It's very hard for most people to imagine what 3,500 acres is. It's virtually from here to the horizon in most directions. But it's 2,000 football fields, or as somebody's already said, it's about 1.5 times, I think, the size of Heathrow Airport. And I was sitting here watching the member for North Durham speak in the main chamber. It's about the size of the city of Durham. A city with a population of 50,000 people. Imagine if you wanted to put in a planning application for houses for 50,000 people, quite how long we'd spend in the process and considering it. It would never happen, of course. So that's what we're dealing with. And despite the fact that they change the character, the use, the appearance of the landscape, they seek to carpet. the person who ever drafted this policy did not have any concept of the rights of local individuals. In effect, because of the national infrastructure rules, the bigger and more damaging the project, the less say local people have. I mean, it's an astonishing perversion of natural justice in these things. And whoever designed the project didn't also take into account the other thought process of the developers, and that is that they would need to seek to put them near to hubs in the national grid. So not only do you get enormous solar farms, you also get lots of them in a single area. So the reason the one is being proposed for my constituency is because of the proximity of Drax Power Station, which means next door in Selby and in the other East Yorkshire and North Yorkshire seats, you've got a proliferation of them. So not only are you penalising 5 villages in my constituency, you're penalising another 5 or 10 villages, the next one and the one after and the one after, all in one place. And as I said earlier in my intervention, my honourable friend, we dismiss these people as NIMBYs. This is their life savings we're damaging. It's their lives and their life savings. And maybe their children's life savings we're damaging. So we should keep in mind what we might call the importance of individual property rights in doing this. Now, there are countless more innovative policies that could be implemented. We've heard, I think the one that seems to be most popular today in terms of what we might do instead would be to legislate to either massively incentivize, or even mandate in some cases the use of the roofs of all new buildings, certainly all new industrial buildings, all new warehouses, all new barns and so on, but also, frankly, houses too. I mean, what has happened in the course of the whole energy policy of the last 20 years is governments have changed the economics to make various things different. I mean, so the solar farms are now more economic than they were 20 years ago. Wind farms are more economic than they were 20 years ago. And the creation of a requirement to use roofs would also engender a new industry. Already Elon Musk has got new designs for solar cells that look like tiles on buildings, that look like and so you would do away with the concerns over the as it were, the aesthetic effect. And they will become cheaper and cheaper if the government does this. So there's a need, I say to the Minister, for some imagination in this, to say to ourselves, what do we want this to look like in 10 years' time, and then design the policies to encourage the industry to deliver just that. Now, we've heard about the effects on farmland. I'll be very brief on this because it's been talked through quite a lot. But farmland, of course, as somebody said, I think my honourable friend from Gainsborough said, farmland is already a solar farm. I mean, it turns sunlight into food. You know? And it's much better at that, much more useful at that, much more flexible and effective at that than actually using it for electricity. And we are, of course, we now have less farmland in production than we have at any time since 1945, since the Second World War. And that date, of course, is important in this context. In these dangerous times which we're now in, do we really think it's sensible that we have to import almost half our food, 46% of our food, in the event of the breakdown, not even the necessity of a continental war, in the event of a serious breakdown of international trade, which has happened a couple of times already through COVID in Ukraine, in the event of a serious breakdown, our ability to access food becomes a real problem. We had a rehearsal during COVID of some of that. And again, so it is not wise. In the papers the last few days, there's a lot of coverage for the King installing, I think, 2,000 panels at Sandringham to create cheap electricity for himself. You know what that is, 2,000 panels? It's 5 acres. That's 1/700th of this one plan I'm talking about here, 1/200th of the 10,000 acres that my honourable friend was talking about earlier around Gainsborough. So that's fine. Small scale is fine. Even 100 acres properly placed is fine, or 200 acres properly placed is fine. But what we're getting now, this massive, huge industrialization of the countryside, simply is not fine. You know, in my part of the world, I have the villages of Spaldington, Willetoft, Brint, Gribthorpe and Fogglethorpe, basically surrounded by solar cells. That's the plan, to surround all these people. All these people's futures, all these people's future environments are being thwarted by that. Now, I hadn't intended to talk about the effect of the Treasury, but since we've got a very smart minister here, I think there is one philosophical point I'll make to him. When the Treasury sets out, and I speak from long, sore experience as a minister in the past, when the Treasury sets out to determine which policy works best or not, their driving concern essentially is cheapness, is low cost, minimising the taxes required to run a policy. Now, that is understandable. That's sort of what they're paid for, right? But because they're so powerful, that overwhelms what ought to be the decision, which economists would call a cost-benefit analysis. In other words, what is the cost to the state, but what's also the cost to our citizens and individuals who have to cope with this? And my honourable friend for Gainsborough mentioned what it did to house prices, for example. We know what it does to people's environments. And what has happened here is you've got a policy where that second component has been completely ignored. That's what I mean by the dead hand of the Treasury. And when he comes to have the arguments on this that I hope he's going to have inside his department, he should talk about a proper cost-benefit analysis. So just as when we're looking at the costs, the energy costs of a photovoltaic cell, we shouldn't just look at its cost here. We should look at the cost to make it, the coal cost, the cost of oppressing Uyghurs and so on. We should also, in terms of the overall policy, look at the impact on everybody, and the impact on local land values and local housing values as well. Because if he does that, he'll come up with a completely different policy. So to come back to the simpler arguments of the day, I agree with my honourable friend in his call for effectively a ban on these solar farms, obviously on greenbelt, but also on proper flexible land, which includes 3B. I live in the countryside of my constituency. I am surrounded by land which is 3A and 3B. I can't tell the difference. Neither can the farmers who farm it. You know, that's where we are. And when it comes to the 3,500 acres I was talking about, they don't know the difference either. The only rule we've got is, as we've heard, the assessors paid for by the investors in the farm. So I'd support an unequivocal ban on large solar farms on green belts, on the UK's best and most agricultural land, including 3B, and strong incentives for development to use rooftops, brownfield land, and poorer quality, unproductive land. And he'll get the argument back to the Treasury, as we heard from my honourable friend who spoke earlier, that it's more expensive to use brownfield land. It's more expensive to use rooftops. That will be the argument that comes back. And the counter-argument is simply this. It's only more expensive in the first element of it, in the taxpayer element of it. It's not more expensive if you look at the dangerous impact on the lives and livelihoods and savings and investments and housing of the people we represent.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Henderson, in this important debate. I should start by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Sleaford and North Hykeham, on securing this and also being wise enough to persuade the backbench business debate to devote an entire 3 hours recognising the strength of feeling that honourable and right honourable members have on this. I also want to commend the previous work, never mind his speech today, my honourable friend from Buckingham, because I know he's been pivotal in trying to make sure that aspects of planning policy were adapted, recognising the impact on land that we have today. Now, why are we in this situation? Now, there's quite a considerable discussion already that's happened about different classifications of land, return on land. Ultimately, we do, as a Conservative government, as a Conservative party, want to make sure that we achieve net zero. and recognising the balance that we need in our energy mix, which will continue to need the continued use of fossil fuels for many decades to come, but to make sure that we are on that sustainable journey to electricity generation, both locally but nationally in that regard. And it is important that solar has a role to play for that. But I think one of the aspects that concerns people, understandably, is that some of the plans which DESNZ and its predecessor departments set up on, all too often, as has been accurately pointed out, the economics then lead to quite a different outcome from what was expected in some of these plans. That goes back to the Labour government, that in trying to encourage people with feed-in tariffs to go on roofs, massively incorrectly calculated what would happen. That led to Chris Huhne, the then Lib Dem Energy Secretary, having to basically curtail that plan. I think it might have been the Right Honourable Member for Kingston and Surbiton who actually killed it off entirely, because frankly the budget had already been blown. And that's important in some of the consideration that we need to think about, and why it's really important that government has an agile approach to understanding how different offers are undertaken and taken up, recognising the financial impact that can have, but also the disproportionate way in which the policy intentions and outcomes are effectively being delivered. Now, why do people want these wonderful agricultural land to be used instead for solar farms? Well, actually, access to sun is one of the good reasons. Sun is great, is there to grow food. It's great for powering. However, probably the key element at the moment is that guaranteed return that farmers are getting in regard for that. And I think it's on average now still about an 8% return, which is considerable. Many of us, I'm sure, would love to have a guaranteed return in that regard. The other element at the moment is actually the tax relief is a really important part for agricultural land. But tax relief to be passed on from generation to generation was intended principally for farming, and to make sure that agricultural land was passed on instead of sold off. And that is, for me, in particular, what we've seen here is because the leases are done in a particular way, it no longer gets excluded from the tax relief in passing that on. And I think that is also an important financial calculation which people make. I'll give way to my little friend.
I think she makes a brilliantly important point, which I had not thought of before, on this question of tax relief, or basically inheritance tax relief. What that has done to the countryside of Britain has meant vast quantities of it are owned by people for a single purpose, to avoid inheritance tax, which actually drives this financialisation of the countryside, which has driven this policy.
Well, I think it's a sensible policy that's in place in tax relief, and just recently I have been lobbying to get aspects of nature to be allowed to be included in that, when we're seeing the edges of fields. At times the farmers and landowners were suggesting they couldn't participate in the environmental land management scheme because they wouldn't get that relief, unlike the solar farms just down the road who'd given entire agricultural elements and still participated. So I think there's a balance to be had. But I think also what's also been pointed out is the impact on tenant farmers. And again, that return, the pricing of land is a key element of which is concerning for those of us representing particularly rural areas, but also trying to make sure that the sums actually add up. Now, when I was Secretary of State, there's been quite a lot of discussion about classification of land. I think it's fair to say the maps are quite old, and they do not differentiate between 3A and 3B. And that is, when I went back into the department 18 months ago, I did ask about what we could do, bearing in mind that we had been tasked with producing a land use framework. Now, I was told it would take several years to redo those maps, which was somewhat disheartening. So I won't pretend that I added any more energy to that at the time in terms of trying to prepare for a land use framework. And there was quite a lot of discussion between myself and then the then Secretary of State. What the analysis that had been shown indicated that in order to, the estimates were that basically about 1% of the land being used for agriculture would be what would be consumed by potential conversion to solar farms. I would be very interested to hear from the Minister what that is right now, including the connections that have already been granted by National Grid. You know, at the same time, National Grid talk about capacity, Actually, they say they've got tons of solar compared to what they can actually connect. And this is what is leading to the concentrations that my right honourable friend says. Because even now, National Grid continue to keep offering connections in areas where a substation or a converter station is going to be built, as opposed to many of the other applications which, frankly, would cost too much money, would not be economic to connect to the grid. But I think that is concerning for me, that all of a sudden you get energy kind of islands, not deserts, but almost being right in front of our eyes. Their purpose of being part of the natural countryside, producing food and other elements of benefit to our country, that is all of a sudden being turned, as I say, into these energy islands. Now, one of the things that I think is important in consideration is about thinking through, and sorry, I should say, there's plenty of grade 4 and even grade 5 land in my constituency that gets used for food production. I do know that DEFRA is keen to try and improve productivity of land. That's why there's been a series of grants in that regard. But I think it's critical that between DEFRA and DESNES, they start to match up in their consideration, in the Minister's considerations of the NSIP plans, what is happening in that regard about the food security element. And the Prime Minister committed to have a food security index to be produced on an annual basis. And I think the use of land and projected use of land is critical in that element. Now, in terms of thinking through what is happening in my own constituency, there have already been solar farms. I'm not going to say they're all bad. They're not. I think it's the growing cumulative effect and the acceleration and almost the blank check that is being given to many of the developers in enticing farmers and landowners to do that. And in particular, I want to single out Friston. The Minister will know my ongoing battle with National Grid about aspects of energy infrastructure in my constituency. By the way, none of it includes a single pylon. We're not talking about pylons here. But there's definitely been a pile-in on the people of that village. And indeed, National Grid has now offered 2 further connections to solar farms of just under 250 megawatts. Now, where do we go from here? Now, I'm conscious that in the National Policy Statement, EN3, it does cover a lot about solar. It doesn't exclude grade 1 land even in consideration, but it is up to the developer to show that they have considered brownfield sites. And I think, Minister, we need some kind of strength and confidence that that really is being done. And that in the considerations, and I know the Planning Inspectorate are the people who provide advice to ministers to make those final decisions, that it really has to be a far more transparent process than people experience today. It does feel it's a very tick-box exercise. It really feels there's like a rubber stamp. And I know that may not be the intention of the Minister or the Secretary of State, but it's critical that we address that. In terms of, I know that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, spoke last October about wanting to make it easier to cut, I think, up to £3 billion of costs a year by trying to get more on brownfield sites. And it would be helpful to understand from the Minister, since her speech and the direction of travel that both she and he and the Prime Minister have set, what has happened since then in terms of the applications, not only for planning but also for connections? Have we seen that change happen, or have we continued to see more and more and more solar farms being proposed instead of agricultural production? In terms of other positive things, though, that the government has done, and I know that my honourable friend leading this debate questions some of the grants that were being given towards barn solar, as I think we christened it at the time. That was deliberately intended to recognise and to provide grants to help farmers to be able to generate electricity to be used on their farms. It's not designed in any way to be used to then be connected anywhere. And I think that's a sensible use of taxpayers' money from the £2.4 billion that is distributed within England or on average every year. But I think it's absolutely key that we try and help farmers with their resilience, but we shouldn't be doing it on the basis that taxpayers' money certainly will be used to fuel higher returns from not actually producing food or looking after livestock. In terms of thinking through what the next steps could be, what I would hope, I've already asked the Minister a few questions. I appreciate he may not have all that information to hand today, but I, like others, I'm looking to see if for a moratorium on connections until there's a steady state of understanding what is happening in this fair and beautiful land. I think it's critical that in terms of the preparation of the land use framework, clearly I'm not in DEFRA anymore, so I don't know where that is in the stages, but the use of energy and that balance versus, of course, housing and other elements, and we can actually have multifaceted land productive in more ways than one. But it's important that we take this opportunity without trying to get away from our targets that we've set of getting to 70 gigawatts by 2035. But let's not go at breakneck speed and end up breaking our necks in this regard. It's really important that we try and make sure there are sensible routes forward by National Grid in terms of connections. Right now, I get the impression they're just approving or dishing out connections to anybody at all without necessarily thinking through what the impact will be on food security or indeed on our countryside.
I am expecting the Minister to take about 15 minutes, so out of fairness, I'm going to give the opposition spokesman the same amount of time. So, Dr.
Am I not right in thinking that it's normal in cases such as this to have spokesmen from the other main parties in this Parliament here answering the debate? In particular, Liberal Democrats believe they feel strongly on this issue. But yet there's been not one single backbencher and not one single minister, shadow minister from the Liberal Democrats in the chamber today. Is that because they don't like the policy, or is it because they can't answer the debate, or is it because they weren't invited? Why are there no Liberal Democrats here?
The honourable gentleman would know that that's not a point of order. But he's made his point, so could I just call on Dr. Alan Whitehead?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your consideration about time available in what I think has been a very useful and educational debate that we've had this afternoon, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for Sleaford and North Hykeham for securing this debate. And I also would like to add a little additional congratulation for the way that honourable members have put their case over this afternoon. The contributions from the honourable member for Redditch, for Buckingham, for North Wiltshire, for Gainsborough, for Halton Price, and for Suffolk Coastal, all I think added greatly to the tissue of this debate this afternoon, which let's sort of perhaps get one or two canards out of the way first, was not to my mind about a lot of people standing up and being NIMBYs, although I do understand, of course, that honourable members will quite rightly want to defend what they consider to be the best interests of their own constituencies is. And we heard in an intervention from the right honourable member for Holland and Deepings, who said he would stand by Holland and Deepings to the last, and also, of course, the right honourable member for Gainsborough, who I think producing evidence perhaps the wrong side in the Civil War, but nevertheless I think made the point very strongly that this is what he was, what he felt he was here to do, as far as the interest of his constituency is concerned this afternoon. That's not about NIMBYism. That's about defending what you think is the best for your own area of the country. And that's the problem, I think, that we've got with how we ally together a policy which I think, by and large, everyone in this chamber is agreed on, and how you actually carry that out in practice. And the policy that I mentioned, which I think there's no real difference between the opposition and the government on, is the strong view that we should move rapidly forward on the deployment of solar across the country. Government has a target of 70 gigawatts of solar to be deployed by 2035. We are saying in our plans for decarbonisation of the energy system by 2030 that we want to see 50 gigawatts installed by 2030. And that, in part, is because we know that solar is now one of the cheapest forms of energy that you can deploy in a basically an energy emergency where we've actually got to produce an enormous amount of additional capacity over the next few years, in addition to replacing what is going away, in order to make sure that our system is resilient and stable and, by the way, homegrown for the future of energy in this country. So the fact that solar absolutely has to play a central role in our overall energy economy for the future, and that the targets for installation of solar are essentially very similar between the opposition and the government, I think underlines just how central it is felt to be that solar should play that key role. Now, when you decide that it's going to play that key role, the next question is, how do you actually do it? And, of course, that is where a lot of the debate today has really landed on. And that is, where do you put solar? How do you put solar in various places? And what's the most beneficial way to do it, assuming you are going to do it for the country as a whole? And it's certainly the case that we will not be able to deliver, much as we might want to, all the solar on roofs and brownfield sites, and certainly not on roofs. But, I mean, as I'll come to in a moment, some of the issues relating to what proportion you can put on those particular areas relate to the way government at the moment sets out planning and other energy management arrangements, which actually prevents or downgrades the possibility of putting those solar panels and those arrangements into roofs and buildings and industrial workplaces and so on. And certainly from our side, we very much want to see, if possible, the predominance of that solar development concentrated on brownfield sites and on roofs and on industrial buildings. But we recognise there's an enormous amount of work to be done in terms of facilitating the planning arrangements and the commissioning arrangements that will allow that to happen. And not least of the matter is that, of course, as far as brownfield sites are concerned, a mention has been made by honourable members this afternoon, particularly the honourable member from Redditch, about the issues as far as cost and remediation and various other things on brownfield sites. Now, solar actually treads very lightly on the earth, and you can do things with solar on brownfield sites that you may not be able to do with other forms of development on the brownfield site, particularly if it does need some form of remediation. So that is not the key issue, but the key issue is the value in an urban context of brownfield sites and the hope value that those sites have, which is very often in considerable counter-distinction to the sort of value that a number of those developers think they might get from land which is not going to change its value on hope or otherwise in terms of their developments. So I'm happy to give way.
I'm listening with interest to the honourable gentleman. Does he agree with me that if we increase the incentive up to the point of mandating in some cases the use of such spaces, brownfield and roofs and so on, that is likely to alter the economics with people like Elon Musk and others investing in more cost-effective and more easily used photovoltaic cells for that purpose?
Well, yes, indeed. I mean, as the right honourable member will know, solar is now not looking for subsidy from the government in the way that, as the member for Suffolk Coastal mentioned, was the case a number of years ago. And it may be that one ought to look at how you can direct the best use of land and facilities for solar by actually reintroducing some of those incentives and disincentives that can actually go into solar development for the future. But that is all, I would emphasise, in the gift of government to bring about as far as changes in how planning is organised, how underwriting is organised, and how frameworks are actually organised. I'm mentioning the land use framework, which has still not come forward from DEFRA. All of these things can, I think, play a much more substantial role in actually getting the balance right as to where you put what is an imperative to develop for the future. Now, some of the questions that have been raised this afternoon are not so much about solar itself, but among other things about the accumulation of particular sites in particular places. And of course, there isn't anything in planning arrangements very easily that can deal with the question of accumulation. And again, that's something that needs to be perhaps put into the context of a wider land use planning arrangement for the future. And I certainly very much understand. I mean, I am from a constituency that actually has one farmer in the constituency, although you're not allowed to recognise who that farmer is in the census because you're not allowed to record one farmer in your census return, so it has to be 2 farmers or no farmers. But what I do recognise and understand is that in the context of the accumulation of a number of these things in rural constituencies, where those rural constituencies can see no benefit for that accumulation for their local population as a real issue. And again, there are issues that may be within the gift of government to bring forward to mitigate that particular problem by enabling local communities to benefit from the output of their particular farms in their areas. But notwithstanding that, it's certainly the case that accumulation that's come about, not just because of developers' lust for very large schemes, but because, for example, at the moment, those are some of the only places where they can get decent connections in the near future. I mean, Lincolnshire, for example, having been the site of 2 power stations, Cottam and West Burton, which have now closed, still has very, very good high-level grid connections. And therefore, there are schemes which might come forward in other parts of the country that don't have such good connections, which are being put on the back burner just because those developers can get particular connections right now. That's also in the gift of the government to actually sort out in terms of actually getting the connections in the country on a regularised basis so that those people who are bringing forward their solar developments can actually have a choice of where to put their connection on the basis of the best site for their developments, rather than just look at the question of the economics of getting a connection right this minute. What I would say overall, very briefly, I think I've got to close my remarks now.
There is a perversity here, of course, which is that the further away from the input into the grid that the site is, the bigger it has to be. So Limedown, the one in my own constituency, because it's 30 miles away from the link into the grid, has to be at least 2,000, probably more acres, in order to pay for the connection.
Well, that's certainly true, but there's a much wider issue of the fact that connections in this country are pretty much available on a lottery basis, because particularly at DNO level, most of the capacity in most DNOs is taken up. At national grid level, the connections are, as I say, entirely dependent on where the lines go, which don't necessarily go to where people want to connect up, and indeed are also very much at the limit of their capacity at the moment. So a national plan which would enable those connections on shore to be actually distributed equally across the country would actually go a long way to facilitating much better deployment distribution of those wind and solar projects that we want to see across the country for the future. So I think I need to say in conclusion, I have great sympathy, whilst not being a rural MP myself, for the problems of accumulation that are particularly developing as far as solar development is concerned. But the solution is not to throw solar out. The solution is to actually do a number of the sort of things that I have mentioned this afternoon to actually get us both to our target that we want to reach, whilst actually securing the equitable deployment of solar across the country in such a way that we can manage our electricity future in a positive way.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. He's talking about equitable distribution, and to some extent I understand the point he's making. But surely where you have areas such as Lincolnshire, which have such very high quality farmland, there is some sense in saying that actually you shouldn't have massive solar farms there at all, because you're simply going to reduce your food security.
Yeah, I was intending to go into the 1, 2, 3, 3A, 3B debate, but I don't think it's going to add anything greatly to what I have to say, except to say that, again, it's in the gift of government for those schemes that are above the 50 megawatt level to actually look at, in the context of the planning guidance we already have, what the overall planning guidance suggests we should do. I personally am a little sceptical of the overall case about food production and land use, because after all, I think a recent estimate was that if we did produce 70 gigawatt target, it would actually take about 0.3% of UK land area, up from 0.1% today, compared with 69% of the land that is farmed. Now, that doesn't add anything to the debate on Lincolnshire itself, but I think the point is that the actual land take of solar overall is actually will be pretty minimal compared with what is in agriculture for the moment. And indeed, as a matter of interest, the land that is taken by solar already is 1/5 of the land that's taken up in the country for golf courses. So, yes.
We'll have an opportunity to wind up our
yes. I'm happy
a question, if I may. I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. He seems to be laying out some of the problem, which is great, but he doesn't seem to be talking about solutions. And as I understand it, Labour will want to form the next government, and my constituents want to understand what their policies will be. He says he doesn't want to get into the grades of land. He suggests that the amount of land taken is negligible. My constituents do not consider the amount of their land that may be taken in their constituency to be negligible. So could he clarify what the Labour policy might be?
Well, I think the honourable lady will forgive me for not being the government right this minute. That it's not my responsibility to actually set out what the government would do for the future. It's my responsibility to actually respond to this debate as the opposition. But I think I've already said what it is we would want to do in terms of planning land use and planning arrangements for the deployment of solar in a much more methodical way, and also at the same time bringing forward arrangements that can, for example, make rooftop and brownfield solar much more achievable than it is at the moment. So to alter the balance of advantage and disadvantage as far as deployment is concerned across the country as a whole. And that I think is probably all that I think the honourable lady can expect from me as far as what we want to do in government is concerned in the future. But I would add, that is something the government can do today. And that is why I hope we will now be able to listen to the Minister tell us what he is going to do in terms of that balancing for getting solar deployed for the future.
For giving way a second time. I've listened very carefully to the Honourable Gentleman's speech, and it's been extremely interesting. I must admit being a little confused as to what the Labour Party policy is in these matters. So let me ask him straightforwardly. Will the incoming, if there is to be one, will the incoming Labour government be more in favour of large-scale solar farms in the countryside or against them?
Well, firstly, that's a really interesting question, as much as actually it isn't necessarily going to be the case there's going to be an incoming Labour government, but it's nice. It is nice to see the honourable member for North Wiltshire declare that there will be an incoming Labour government. So that's really helpful. But should there be an incoming Labour government, we will want to make sure that we can reach our targets of solar deployment in an equitable way for the country as a whole. And if that means bringing in new forms of legislation and guidance and rules which allow that distribution to take place in an equitable way, well, that is what we will do. But that, as I'm sure the honourable member will agree, would take about 3/4 of an hour to unpack in terms of its detail. So we'll have to leave it for now. But I'm very, very happy to have a cup of tea with him in the not-too-distant future and set that all out in some detail if he would find that interesting.
Thank you very much, Mr. Henderson. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today, and I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Sleaford and North Wycombe, for securing this incredibly important and timely debate on large-scale solar and the impact of the plans on rural England in particular. It's been fantastic to hear some incredibly passionate and well-informed speeches from the members for Redditch, Buckingham, music to my ears, talking about the benefits of small modular reactors, North Wiltshire, Gainsborough, again, talking about the positive benefits can be brought from further investment into nuclear power, hence why we unveiled the civil nuclear roadmap just earlier this year, the biggest investment in nuclear in 70 years, and I think you would struggle to find a bigger advocate for the benefits of our domestic oil and gas industry than myself. And I would like to reassure him that despite my Scottish Presbyterian upbringing, I do associate myself much more as a Cavalier than a Roundhead. The member for Halton Price and Howden, and indeed the member for Suffolk Coast. I think I've engaged with just about every one of you individually, or every one of the members individually, on various energy infrastructure projects, not least recently on solar. But it was also good to see so many other Conservative members representing the Devizes, Bedford, Newark, South Holland and the Deepings, Sedgefield, Cleethorpes, Ludlow, Staffordshire Moorlands, and to hear from them through their various interventions the huge concerns that they have from their communities. I understand. I represent a vast rural constituency that encompasses some of the best farmland north of the border itself, looking at a significant energy infrastructure build over the next few years. So I completely understand and have heard myself the concerns from local communities who are indeed worried about what this build will mean for the countryside in which they live and of which they are so fond. 3 years ago, the government adopted its sixth carbon budget, the world's most ambitious climate change goal to reduce emissions by 77% by 2035, compared to 1990 levels. The government also committed to fully decarbonise the electricity system by 2035, subject to security of supply. Renewables such as solar and wind, alongside other low-carbon technologies, like nuclear, will underpin the UK's transition from reliance on fossil fuels to a new, secure, clean energy system. Solar is an important part of the energy mix, and its deployment is a key part of the government's strategy for energy independence and clean growth. As set out in the British Energy Security Strategy and the Energy Security Plan, we are aiming for up to 70 gigawatts of solar capacity by 2035. To achieve this, we need to deploy both rooftop, but yes, ground-mounted technology. Now, ground-mount technology is one of the cheapest forms of electricity generation and is readily deployable at scale. As such, the government considers that there is a strong need for increased ground-mount solar deployment, as reflected in the recently published Energy National Policy Statements. However, I and the department recognise that, as with any new development, solar projects may impact on communities and indeed the environment. The planning system must allow all views to be taken into account when decision makers balance local impacts with the national need. Now, as has been referenced already here today by a number of colleagues, due to the quasi-judicial role of ministers in determining planning applications, I hope that members will appreciate it would not be appropriate for me to comment on any specific matters in relation to specific projects in the planning system, nor can I comment on the merits or harms of any particular proposals, as this could be as prejudging the subsequent outcome. The government, however, does recognise that solar projects can impact on land use, and I can speak to that. It is important that the government strike the right balance between these considerations and securing a clean energy system for the future. Again, this is why the planning system must take these issues into account. Now, as set out in the recently published revised NPAC N3, solar developers should, where possible, utilise previously developed land, brownfield land, contaminated land and industrial land. Where the proposed use of any agricultural land has been shown to be necessary, poorer quality land should be preferred to higher quality land, avoiding the best and most versatile agricultural land where possible. If it is proposed to use any land falling under Natural England's best and most versatile agricultural land classification, that's grades 1, 2 and 3A, has already been said, developers are required to justify using such land and design their projects to avoid, mitigate and, where necessary, compensate for any impacts. But it is clear to me and the government that concerns remain about the scale and volume of projects being applied for on BMV land in specific areas of the country, specifically in areas around the country with historic and established grid connections. We do have concerns that not all developers are properly considering these requirements, and this is something that needs to be rectified, and we want to see this following the new EN3 publication. So although I can say little of detail here, I want to assure members that we are listening, and indeed work is ongoing to see what can be done to ensure that that balance is indeed met. Some reference has been made to the fact there's very few Liberal Democrat, Liberal Democrat members in the chamber this afternoon. The honourable member, my friend, the member for Redditch, described their policy as being a banana, which is build absolutely nothing anywhere new. Build absolutely nothing anywhere ever. However, near anybody. However, actually, that's not the case. The Lib Dems' proposal is, in fact, and it was voted on at their conference last year, to remove restrictions on new solar and wind to accelerate deployment of renewable power. So it's quite clear why there are no Liberal Democrats in the chamber today, because they would ride roughshod over the views of rural communities around the country to increase the deployment at pace and at scale of solar around the country, and indeed other technologies as well. And I thought the reason that there weren't very many Labour members here today is, as the honourable member suggested, because not very many of them, by virtue of where they are elected, represent rural communities and therefore are not seeing mitigating the impact of these applications. I am now of the opinion, though, that they are maybe just as confused about the Labour Party policy on this as we all are, following what I have to admit was a very interesting speech from my honourable friend, the Labour opposition spokesperson. Solar and farming can be complementary, supporting each other financially, environmentally, and through shared use of land. And analysis does show that even in the unlikely scenario that all additional solar needed to meet the British energy security strategy ambition of 70 gigawatts were to come forward as ground-mounted solar, which is not going to be the case, it would be less than 1% of UK utilised agricultural land, which includes all types of agricultural land, that would be needed to accommodate it. However, as I have already referenced, the concentration of so many of these projects in specific areas is concerning, and UK-wide analysis cannot take this into account. So although, again, I'm unable to say any specific at this time, I can assure colleagues that we are indeed listening. Government considers improving our energy security is urgent and of critical importance to the country. On that, I don't think there is any disagreement, but that it must be achieved together with maintaining food security for our United Kingdom. Solar projects and agricultural practice can coexist. For example, the science of agrivoltaics, developing in which solar is integrated with arable farming in innovative ways, is coming on leaps and bounds. Solar energy can also be an important way for farmers to increase their revenue from land less suited to higher value crop production. On that, again, there is very little disagreement. But protecting our environment, supporting rural communities, backing British farmers and delivering long-term energy security with more low-carbon energy are ultimately what to achieve. And I want to give a guarantee that this government and this department certainly will not countenance the industrialisation of our green and pleasant land. It is possible to maintain and increase our food production to a more sustainable way in some areas and to see land use change occur in others. Now, cumulative impacts has been brought up multiple times this afternoon, so I'd quite like to turn to that briefly. The planning system does set out how applicants and decision makers should consider the impact of cumulative impacts. Applications for solar deployments and developments under the NSIP regime should identify the cumulative impacts of situating a solar farm in proximity to other energy generating stations and infrastructure when preparing an application for a development consent order. It is then a matter for the examining authority to consider cumulative in-combination effects with the other solar farm proposals and other developments in the locality when conducting an examination of a particular NSIP solar project. The views of interested parties during examination, which will include advisory bodies and local planning authorities, will be taken into account in the examining authority's recommendations. However, again, this is something that we are looking at. I want to give colleagues that guarantee. As I've said and already referenced, I and the department appreciate the concerns raised about the clustering of projects in some areas around grid connections. As we bring more new energy infrastructure online to meet the demand for clean, secure electricity, so too must we increase grid capacity. As set out in the spring budget, the government is working with Ofgem and network companies to release more network capacity and prevent speculative projects from obtaining and retaining network capacity. This should result in more capacity across the country and help reduce the clustering that we are seeing of these projects. Community engagement has also been raised this afternoon. It is vitally important. Vitally important, and this is where the Conservative and Labour Party policies on this differ dramatically, that communities have a voice in the decisions of their local area. There are established routes in the planning system to consider the impacts of solar projects and to enable communities to raise concerns about developments. Now, I know there are concerns around how effective this is. However, I will set out what the policy is as it stands right now. The National Planning Policy Framework, which underlies the planning system for projects below 50 megawatts, encourages developers, including those proposing solar projects, to engage with local communities before submitting an application. Local authorities will consider a range of factors when assessing applications, including visual and environmental impacts. Members of the public can submit their views to the planning authorities, and significant concerns will be taken into account as part of the local decision-making process. Developers taking larger projects through the NSIP regime must complete considerable community engagement before any approval is granted, giving communities ample opportunity to feed in their views. The level and quality of community engagement, amongst other factors, will be taken into account by decision makers, and of course I'd be happy to give way.
As this question of consultation. However, we had extensive consultation in Wiltshire, and I went along to all of the meetings they had, the PR people that have to do these things in order to achieve. And I said to each of them, will you take account of the fact that most of the people here don't want this thing to happen at all? We want to stop it. We want to keep it green fields. And they said, no, we're not entitled to, we can't consider that matter. All we can consider is the design of the solar farm. The consultation process is bogus.
I thank my honourable friend for his point. Again, he references the specific project in his constituency, to which I cannot, but I'm sure that his concerns have been heard. They're certainly not new concerns that are being raised. They're concerns that have been raised with me in the past, and as I said, we are quite genuinely and clearly listening to those concerns that are being raised in the entire process. Yes, I'd be happy to give way.
He's right to talk about how the MPS EN3 is talking about the planning application process. One of the points that I made is about the connection process. So connections are just being offered left, right and centre. Now, for communities, they then see that almost as automatically that then happening in the future. And indeed themselves, National Grid are building their infrastructure around connections they're giving out, regardless of whether or not planning applications are future. So I do feel, and I appreciate my honourable friend might not be able to reply today, that the department and he really need to look at that connection happening, and that's why I called for a moratorium on anything further.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for her point. As she knows, I am no longer the minister responsible for the network or the National Grid, but I will ensure that her concerns are passed on to the relevant minister. And what I would say is that Ofgem and the ESO are engaged in a considerable review of how connections are indeed offered across the country, because there is a problem with that system that is recognised and is being addressed. I'd like to briefly touch on community benefits, because that has also been raised. It is important communities can participate in and benefit from the deployment of new low-carbon and energy technologies in the local areas. However, the government does not have a formal role with regards to community benefits for solar and other large-scale renewable energy projects. These are best agreed, we believe, at a local level between the renewable operator and the local community, so they can be tailored to each community's individual needs. They cannot be taken into account and, I'm afraid, are not relevant to the planning decisions. A number of solar developers already provide community benefits on a voluntary basis, and we are actually working with Solar Energy UK, the industry body, to provide further guidance and advice on community benefits for solar developers and communities to develop a more consistent approach across the country that is fair to all parties. I'd be very happy to give way.
Dr. White, does the Minister accept that under the present trading arrangements for energy, a developer cannot provide a trading benefit for a local area only and has to treat it as if it were a national benefit? Is the Minister interested in changing that so that benefits can come to local areas rather than simply be spread, as honourable members have said, across the national grid?
As I said, we're working with the solar industry right now to develop proposals and give them guidance and advice on how to best support local communities and deliver community benefits, so that these communities who are hosting these projects on behalf of the wider nation do see a benefit, and we are not closing our minds to any suggestions that might benefit these communities moving forward. This is a wholesale change in how we deliver energy across the UK, so we should be open to thinking about how we do that in the most appropriate fashion. I want to assure honourable and right honourable members that we are deploying rooftop solar, and it remains a key priority for the government and continues to be one of the most popular and easily deployed renewable energy sources. We want to see more rooftop solar on industrial and commercial properties such as warehouses, factories and buildings in order to make maximum usage of available surfaces for business as well as environmental and climate benefits, and there will be more in the solar roadmap which will be published in the next few months on that. I want to briefly turn to the issue of forced labour, which was raised. I did address this in the Chamber of the House of Commons just the other evening in response to a debate being brought by my honourable friend, the member for Rutland and Melton, but as it has been brought up again today, just want to reassure members that the government is committed to tackling the issue of Uyghur forced labour in supply chains, including the mining used in the manufacture of solar panels, and is taking robust action. And over the last 2 years, we've introduced new guidance on the risks of doing business in Xinjiang, introduced enhanced export controls, and announced the introduction of the financial penalties for those who fail to report, as required under the Modern Slavery Act. This followed our announcement in September 2020 of the package of changes to Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act, and these changes will require large businesses and also public bodies to report on specific areas within their modern slavery statements, including their due diligence processes in relation to modern slavery, and there will be yet more on that also within the solar roadmap on what the industry itself is doing to ensure that it is not reliant on forced labour anywhere in the world, but in particular in China. Mr. Henderson, to conclude, we need to see an increase in ground-mounted solar alongside rooftop solar over the next decade to meet our energy security and net zero goals, and to reduce costs to consumers. But it is clear to me, the Secretary of State and His Majesty's Government in general, that this growth must be sustainable and enabled by a robust planning system that balances these wider benefits with the local impacts, and that local communities are listened to, and that food security concerns are addressed. And that is what we are committing to do. I look forward to the publication of the Solar Roadmap, which is the result of the Solar Task Force work. The document will set out deployment scenarios, as well as key actions needed to address challenges in several priority areas, including grid, rooftop supply chains, and skills. And I would like to thank, once again, my honourable friend for bringing forward. Of course, I would be happy to give way.
I thank the Minister very much. Can he enlighten us when this solar roadmap will be published?
I can't. It is imminent. I'd like to assure my honourable friend it is imminent. We will be seeing the publication within the next few weeks. Again, I would like to close by thanking Spring, my honourable friend, for bringing forward this important debate. And I think the contributions this afternoon have been enlightening, well-informed, and do show the passion with which members, who I'm proud to serve with, have for the local communities that they are honoured to represent in this place. Thank you very much.
Dr Johnson to wind up.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I'd like to thank, first of all of my honourable and honourable friends for coming along today to contribute either by intervention or by really very magnificent speeches. I think we agree, as I started the speech with agreement, I've finished the debate with agreement, I think we agree on so many things on our side of the House. My constituents currently feel under siege. They feel under siege as they wait for the results of a planning decision that could ruin many aspects of their life. They could imagine yourself, you own a house, you live in a rural village like Scotwick, for example, and when you go for a walk your dog on a morning, you enjoy the beautiful countryside and the sunshine. But with this plan, you're going to be walking through field after field after field for miles around of 4-metre high solar panels. That is going to spoil much of the enjoyment of the countryside on your house. We know that that will have effect on my constituents' mental health and well-being. We heard today about how inefficient solar farms, or solar panels are as a form of energy, both compared with other forms of green energy, and as they become better pieces of technology with time, how these large ones put in the countryside will become obsolete long before their 40 years are up. We've heard that they're not as green as they're said to be, and they're certainly not as morally clean as we may wish them to be. We've heard of the importance of protecting the countryside, particularly productive farmland, and of farm security. And we've heard how it's important and that everybody has the right to defend their area, not because they're a NIMBY, but because they care about where they live. We've also heard about farmers, and I should mention at this point that my husband is a farmer, so I understand, perhaps as well as most, about the challenges of farming at the moment and the difficulties posed financially by some of the weather issues that we've had this year. I also heard today that there is no real objection on this side of the House to small-scale development of solar for farmers, which will help to de-risk some of the farming challenges, but also not have a huge impact on the community. And also about the particular difficulties of tenant farmers who may be chucked off the land they farmed for generations simply to put solar farms on instead. We also heard about government measures to incentivise brownfield and rooftop, and I'm very, very pleased to hear that this solar plan is imminent, and I'm really looking forward to having it. One of the things the Minister said was that where possible we should have brownfield or poor quality land, and that the developer has to justify if they're not using such land. But in practice, if you're looking at a county like Lincolnshire, which has very little of the latter, you can therefore make a justification that there is no rubbish land locally because it's all good. That is therefore not tight enough for me, and it needs that loophole closing. He also talked about cumulative effect, and I want to draw his attention to something he might not be aware of because it sits outside his brief, which is the reservoir that they propose to build also in my constituency, and yet another NSIP project taking up many thousands of acres of 5 square kilometres indeed, of currently productive and in some cases organic farmland. To the cumulative effect of development, when as he puts it, we're hosting infrastructure for the whole country, it's important to look not just at the energy infrastructure that an area is being asked to host, but the wider infrastructure that a community is being asked to bear. for the greater good. And also, there have been lots of mentions of a land use plan today. Could he tell me when he expects that to be published, or could he go back to DEFRA to tell me when that could be published? I can see the Minister is nodding. I wanted to draw his attention to the widespread nature of the debate today, just by listing some of the counties that we've heard from today. Suffolk, Yorkshire, Nottinghamshire, Wiltshire, Bedfordshire, Rutland, Shropshire, Worcestershire, Derbyshire, North Lincolnshire, Oxfordshire, Durham, Staffordshire, and the greatest concentration of them all in Lincolnshire. I think this should demonstrate to him the scale of it. Buckinghamshire. I knew I'd miss one out. The scale of this. It should demonstrate to him the scale and the widespread nature of the problems that we face. I was quite disappointed to hear what the Labour spokesperson had to say, because he talked about solar being an important part of the solution to net zero. He talked about it being important to consider planning. Well, yes, of course. He reported about supporting onshore wind, which I know that my constituents, by and large, do not support the idea of covering their beautiful farmland in windmills instead of solar. He talked about spreading it out evenly, but what does that mean? Does that mean every district council has to have so many? How does that work in the centre of London? It didn't really have a policy, and I think for a party who think they might be in government in less than 6 months' time, I think that's really quite remarkable. I'm also pretty disgusted to see there was nobody else here from the backbenches on the opposition at all, be that SNP, Liberal Democrat or Labour. Do they have no interest in the countryside? I've always thought that to be the case, and this shows it to be true. And finally, I just wanted to say, I met with the Prime Minister just before Easter on a one-to-one basis, and I am certain both of his understanding of the importance of dealing with this issue and of his commitment to do so. I am also very clear that we have a minister here who is both capable and committed to achieving what his boss has asked him to do and to delivering for my constituents. But I ask him to do so as quickly as possible.
The question is that the House has considered large-scale solar farms. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.